Well, today I'm joined by John Buck. John joins me to talk about the problem of evil. And today we're talking about a theodicy that John has developed, the Participation Theodicy. The problem of evil is something that has challenged me deeply for many, many years. I can't reconcile the idea of an all-knowing, all-powerful, all-loving God and the evidential problem of evil, especially from what we see within the fossil records, from the lineage that we can see ourselves within. There seems to be a conflict or an overlap or a missing of directions between these two things. How can this exist and that makes sense? Well, that's what theodicies try to accomplish, right? So I want to speak to theists and understand their perspectives. And I've had John on today for an absolutely fantastic conversation. I mean, we started at 8 o'clock my time. It is just hit midnight. It's a long conversation, but that's because we dive into so many interesting facets and really the nuts and bolts of the problem of evil, and then throw in John's participation theodicy time and time again to understand how that begins to grapple with and try to make sense of the various elements and forms that come up from the classic challenges within the problem of evil. If it's your first time checking out the show, I'd ask you to hit the subscribe button, and then if you select the bell notification icon if you're on YouTube, that will mean you're reminded whenever we release a video here on the channel. If you wouldn't mind giving it a thumbs up and then sharing it, we grow because you take the time to share our content with your friends and your family and your followers. So please do share this conversation, help this to go far and wide, because John is an absolute legend. I thoroughly enjoyed this. We both did so much prep. The one thing that I wish I could have done better was going through the counter example at the very end. We were pushed for time and I was flagging, I'm not going to lie, but I wish I spent a little bit more time just diving into some of the nuances and facets of that counter argument, although John has some great comments that he will share with us towards the end of the conversation. Anyway, I'll stop spoiling it. I hope you enjoy this conversation on the participation theodicy to the problem of evil with John Buck. Cheers. Hello and welcome to the show. My name's Samuel and today I'm joined by John Buck. John, it's good to have you on the show.
Thanks, Samuel. Yeah, thanks for having me. This will be a good conversation.
I'm really looking forward to it. Yeah. We're chatting just before. This is the first time that we've actually kind of spoken face to face. There's been a lot of Twitter and email, but not actually in person, which is I'm looking forward to it. It's going to be good. A lot of people might not know who you are. So would you mind giving my audience a bit of an overview about you and kind of, where you are with sort of philosophy, I guess?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's probably fair that nobody knows who I am, given that I have very little sort of public presence. I'm really just a guy that became took a great appreciation of philosophy later on in life, and then developed a sort of curiosity towards learning philosophy and better understanding things. And then through that sort of process, I eventually became a convert to Catholicism, mostly, well, for a variety of reasons. But yeah, since then I've sort of continued on the attempt to better understand the world from a particularly Christian or a Catholic lens. I have a Twitter page basically where I do Twitter apologetics for Catholicism / Christianity. And so I'm not an important philosopher or anything like that. I'm just somebody who cares about philosophy and wants to do it well. And so I use the internet as a sort of means to do so through interactions like this from people that are charitable and acting in good faith and being able to sort of respond and help correct me in where my thoughts may go wrong. So yeah, that's why I do stuff like this.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're especially on Twitter, the stuff you put out there, the arguments, I love it. Definitely. I mean, for the listener viewer, there'll be links to you, John, on Twitter and wherever else you are, for them in the description. So check those out. But I think this is going to be really interesting. I mean, I wasn't going to go into this at all, but just from what you said, I think it'd be quite helpful. So it sounded like you said you kind of came to philosophy to look at the big questions and then converted to Catholicism because of that. Were you ever a Catholic before that and left the faith and came back, or was that a kind of a thing because of? Tell me that story. That sounds really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, so I was raised in a non-denominational Christian household, or nominally Christian household, where my parents had attempted to sort of rejoin Christianity with the Judaism that preceded it. So I was raised in a sort of what's known as a Messianic Jewish household, or a Hebrew roots version of Christianity. And so that's how I sort of grew up. And it was through a more careful understanding of like, okay, what is Christianity? Why is it that we don't believe in these typical things that most Christians do? That led me into consideration of the more historical faiths, that being Eastern Orthodoxy and Catholicism. And I especially appreciate, like, especially within Eastern Orthodoxy, there is that like attempt to bring continuity to the ancient Hebrew faith into sort of the modern world, where you'll have the Pascha, the understanding of Passover or Easter as being directly connected to the Passover of the Jewish people. And like being able to see that connection made me really appreciate the ancient faith of Eastern Orthodoxy, up until the point in which I sort of recognized that my problems with a sort of Protestant ecclesiology, that means like how a church is run, were also going to apply towards Orthodox ecclesiology, which led me into moving over into Catholicism in 2021. So yeah, I've been Catholic for, I guess, 3 years now.
Oh man, that's really cool. That's really cool. I find it fascinating when somebody from whatever walk of life begins to kind of honestly and intellectually engage with something and you just follow that path to wherever it leads, and you're robust about that. I think, I don't really care where people land. I want people to do that journey well. So that's really cool. That's really cool. Okay, so today we're going to be chatting about basically a theodicy that you've kind of written or kind of prepared to the problem of evil. So for those people who don't know, basically, a theodicy is basically a way that somebody would try and explain or justify a omniscient, omnibenevolent, omnipotent God, given the fact that there's so much pain and suffering around us. There are two versions of it. There's the logical problem of evil and the evidential problem of evil. So we're going to kind of be diving into all of that today. It's a really interesting theodicy that you've kind of pulled together. Is it worth kind of spending any more time on kind of the two definitions of the problem of evil, John? What do you think?
I don't think so, because like a logical problem of evil is just going to, like, basically even an evidential problem of evil is going to have a sort of logical structure to it. It's just going to be like, how plausible is the premise? Is it something like, I don't think there's a sort of sharp distinction between a logical problem versus an evidential problem, because like either way, it's a problem, and like it's going to have some sort of logical structure to it. So I don't know. I think that's just a sort of like way in which people will differentiate between like, okay, this piece of evidence is sort of like not going to be compatible with any conception of theism. Which would be like a sort of logical problem of evil. And then like maybe evidential problems would grant that there are certain ways of like making sense of the evil, but it's just going to be using highly implausible premises in order to get to that sort of account. And so that's where it's like, okay, yeah, maybe a theist could theoretically adopt this position, this position, and this position, but each of these are like independently super implausible. So like the argument from evil would still go through on an evidential basis rather than on a strictly logical basis. I guess that's one distinction, I guess, between the two.
Yeah, nice. No, that's really helpful. And I kind of also want to reiterate to those listening as well. We said this before we were online, but kind of better for people to know now. Like, this isn't a debate. This is really much the problem of evil is something that I struggle to reconcile with the idea of a God, and I want to evaluate this and explore this space as kind of honestly and robustly as possible, much like we spoke about your journey and how you did that intellectually, you did that, and you followed where it went. But I want to do the same thing here. So I've got a list of questions which might sound like they're me trying to be extra difficult, but actually what I hope these questions do is they sort of hit all the notes that somebody listening might be raising in their head without the way to explain it. So I've kind of tried to come at it from many different angles, and hopefully it just gives a really robust kind of conversation around the problem of evil and kind of specifically this theodicy itself. Final probably note for the listener viewer is that I'm going to be sharing my screen quite a lot for this conversation. So if you are listening on any sort of podcast platform, you might want to jump over to the video version for this. I mean, I will read everything out, but it's sometimes easier to follow along if you're actually Yeah, got it up on your screen. Okay, sweet. Let me share my screen. So the kind of first thing I really want to do, I guess, is kind of talk about how we would evaluate a theodicy. So this is kind of like this this argument or this thing somebody's putting forward. What is it trying to do? What its objectives? Now, we've both gone away and we've actually read a dissertation by a professor, I believe, called Beth Secord. It was actually her dissertation from a good few years ago, and she's still writing in the space of the problem of evil. So there'll be a link to her as well in the description. So all kind of credit to her. This is kind of me pulling stuff from that and sort of augmenting it to make it a little bit fuller. And I've also pulled some stuff from Adams from 1999, which is that sort of horrendous evils and the goodness of God. It's quite a famous book within the problem of evil space. So this I kind of want to present with you, John, so that you can kind of chat through whether you think this is right. Like, are these the things that a theodicy should do? So I'll read it out for those listening. For God to be justified in permitting evil, and for specific theodicies to stand, it must be shown that God has 1. Enabled some greater good to be accomplished through suffering, 2. That the greater good must necessarily significantly outweigh all suffering, 3. And that the greater good must be unable to come about via lesser evils and or suffering, and 4. That horrendous evils experienced by specific individuals can be overcome by the greater goods, thus making the lives of these individuals of greater good to them on the whole. And the kind of way that I've defined horrendous evils really is from Adam's book. So she kind of defines them as things which degrade a sentient creature so severely that their life is devoid by prima facie ruinous evil or meaning. So an example might be a parent running over their child by mistake as they back out the drive, or a kind of mental/physical abuse that somebody experienced so severely as a child that they kind of almost completely cognitively ruined, like they're unable to make relationships or attachments, and they go through life kind of devoid of the sort of joys that you would expect people to have. Another example might be death camps or something like that, Auschwitz. So John, I'm going to kind of throw the ball over to you. Kind of, do you think this is what a theodicy should be doing?
I do, but I recognize that there are other theists that would disagree. So like I'm thinking of like specifically a sort of Thomist philosopher like somebody like Paul Davies, who might argue that God is not a moral agent. And so it would be inappropriate for us to expect God to correspond with our with moral obligations and responsibilities, given that that's just not the sort of thing that God is. And I think that Davies is actually like attempting to do a theodicy in some sense. But it's not so much like a it's not so much like a moral justifying version of a theodicy, but almost like dismantling the very premises that would lead us to find there to be a problem of evil. I will say, like, I do think that God is a moral agent, at least in some sense, given that God creates creatures and then is responsible for their creation and things like that. But I think that like maybe at a minimal level, a theodicy is just something to resolve the problem of evil, and that could be done. That could be done either by giving God certain justifying reasons for allowing evil, or by getting rid of the expectation that God would require there to be moral reasons for allowing evil. Yeah.
That's very interesting. That's very interesting. And I read Adams's book, kind of, I think over the last 3 or 4 days. Like I just smashed through it. I found it absolutely fascinating. I read it a long time ago, and since then I've read a lot more philosophy, and it made a lot more sense the second time through, which was great. But what I found really interesting about sort of kind of her way of doing this, and I've also spoken to Jimmy Aiken in the past on my previous show about the problem of evil, and something that kind of people keep pointing to is this idea of a kind of I guess the idea of a human life. And it's something I kind of wanted to kind of chat through with you, because if there's obviously a non-religious person listening to this, they're going to be kind of viewing the problem of evil through the lens of you're born and you die, and when you die, death is death. There's no kind of afterlife. But obviously a lot of kind of people that believe in God are believing in some sort of afterlife. And I kind of feel like at times that means that a lot of people are going to be talking past each other, potentially not kind of coming at things from the same track. So how do you kind of go down this road? Do you think that that God is going to be able to kind of continue after kind of us passing to kind of reconcile the evils that we might experience or others have experienced. And that means that actually kind of it's not just a this life done and dusted, it's a this life plus kind of eternity potentially? Or do you think that actually within this life God should be kind of giving us some sort of return on what's coming? What are your thoughts basically around sort of kind of our lifespan and the problem of evil?
Yeah, so I think that a successful theodicy, and by successful I mean like a persuasive theodicy, and like justifiably persuasive, not just persuasive in the sense of like I've got a gun, you better accept this theodicy, something like that, but just like something that makes sense to the listener, and that's that like yeah, this makes sense from a reasonable. This is a reasonable approach. Would be that it provides, yeah, it convinces the listener. But I think that if a theodicy rests upon certain presumptions about like an afterlife and things like that, that's going to be something that's additional to the theodicy than actually part of their background knowledge. Like, yeah, to the Christian, it can make a lot of sense that, yeah, this life is not all there is. There's much more that can be done even after a person's death. But for an agnostic or an atheist, that's not a given. You have to like make a case for that as part of the theodicy. And like that the whole point of a theodicy is trying to make it plausible. And so yeah, I guess the atheist could grant, yes, if God exists, he could resurrect someone from the dead and like maybe restore them all the goods that they missed out on in their earthly life in the next one. But what reason do we have to think that there is such an afterlife? And that's where, I don't know, maybe NDEs could be used by somebody to try to like make that more plausible to somebody. But yeah, I just think that like the addition of further points is just going to add to the complexity of the theodicy and make it less plausible to the individual that's hearing it.
Yeah, no, I think that's really, really fair. I think that the sort of thing that I struggle with, not in a bad way, but kind of I find frustrating is when you're presented with a theodicy and the theodicy is asking you to also accept all this other baggage over here, and you just want the argument to be kind of contained and self-sufficient rather than having to take on all these other premises that you could add anything onto to an argument to make it completely robust, but actually the argument itself needs to present and kind of be viable to some description. So that's helpful. Okay, I want to dive into obviously your actual theodicy, the participation theodicy. I've done a lot of talking, so John, I don't know, would you mind being the one to read this out for us?
Yeah, no, that'd be great. So I want to clarify this argument that I laid out here in my second paper. It is just an argument to respond to the logical problem of evil, to show that the coherence between evil and God is present. Like it's not the case that evil and God is incoherent. And so I'll go ahead and read out the argument. Premise one: God could create an ideal world, and this is going to be the proposition A, while God retained a purely good character. Or I guess, yeah, A and B. Like, yeah, these two propositions. God can create an ideal world, and God has a purely good character. Like, these two propositions are consistent with one another. Premise two: if God could create an ideal world while God retained a purely good character, then both God and creatures could create an ideal world, C, while God retained a purely good character. So the idea is that, like, okay, if you have A and B already, then you could just add C to the mix, and that would all like the C being that God and creatures are are creating an ideal world, while God retains that purely good character. Premise three: if both God and creatures could create an ideal world while God retained a purely good character, then there could be initially a non-ideal world with creatures while God retained a purely good character. And we can go over the justification for this premise and the one prior to that as well. But just to sort of lay out the reasoning to the argument. So like, yeah, if God could create a world with creatures, then that would give a reason for why there would be, then that would be an instance in which there's a non-ideal world while there's creatures participating in creating that world. Premise four: if there could be an initially non-ideal world with creatures while God retained a purely good character, then some evils could occur while God retained a purely good character. So that's the premises. A and B are E and B are consistent with one another. So some evils could occur while God retained a purely good character. So in the symbolic form, that's just the propositions in conjunction with one another. And actually, I think, yeah. I think there's actually a little bit of a flaw, because that first premise should be a possible premise, because it's saying it's possible that God creates an ideal world and God retains a purely good character in that. And then from that possibility is going to lead to other possibilities, other consistencies, such that the conclusion is going to be, it's possible that there's some evil that exists in the world and God still retains his purely good character. And this is strictly talking about a logical possibility. And so it's just trying to make sense of like how it is that there could be evil in conjunction with God retaining a purely good character. Yeah, that I wish I'd sort of reread the argument and maybe formulated it a little bit more amenable to people listening. But unfortunately, that's how papers sometimes go out. But
Well, that's it. Yeah, I was going to say like there's an entire paper that kind of goes with this argument, which goes into all the detail and all the sort of kind of
sure.
sub points as well. So yeah, there's obviously that. I don't know, John, whether you want to make that available for people to kind of click on and read. Following
Yeah.
this, would you like
Yeah.
that? Yeah. Okay, sweet. Well, obviously then that will be in the description. So listen, if you want to kind of pause it here, go and read the paper, then come back, feel free. That's totally cool. Okay, cool. So I've got a ton of questions. As I already mentioned, these questions are to kind of just probably dive into this a little bit more. And I want to kind of close with some sort of, I guess, wider examples, really to hone into that logical kind of consistency point. Like, how could it be possible for this kind of God to also be here and real if there is this evil? And then I've kind of got a counter argument. I wanted to find it's a particularly strong counter argument because I don't know if I'm very good at creating counter arguments, but I've done my best to kind of create one which we could then go into at the very end, which would be hopefully quite interesting. So
Yeah.
Let's dive into the questions if you're happy. I'm going to leave this Theodicy up on the screen for us as we're speaking, but it's probably going to come down for the viewers so they can just see our beautiful faces. So if you need to pause it at any point or whatever, or click on the link to go read the Theodicy again, please do that. It's obviously going to be linked in the description.
Yeah. Okay. Well, before we go into the questions, I feel like I should try to like give out some of the motive. Like I gave the sort of strict logical argument, but that's not very like persuasive to most people. So I'd like to sort of like paint a picture, I suppose, of what the motivations behind the Theodicy are. So in my paper, I have a description of like a father who, and actually today is Mother's Day, so this is fortuitous. So a father, he wants to do something nice for his wife, and so he decides to make breakfast in bed for her. And he has the option of making the entire breakfast all by himself and then giving it to her to wake her up. And that would be a really good thing because like he's an excellent chef. He's really skilled in this regard, and she would really enjoy that. But he considers, well, what if I were to wake up some of the children and offer them the opportunity to contribute towards the making of breakfast for mommy? And he considers that to be a good thing. And so he does wake up the children and gives them little tasks to do with regards to the making of breakfast. And so like some of them are like cracking the eggs and they're getting some shells mixed in and it's like, oh, that's not great. Others are like toasting the bread and then, oh, they left it in too long. And so it's gotten a little bit burnt. And the other is like spreading the butter and is like poking holes through it and different things like that. Like the pancake batter is mixed everywhere. It's not thoroughly cooked and things like that. And like the father is like allowing the kids to actually contribute towards the actual breakfast that their mother is going to enjoy. And he could have just stepped in and like corrected everything that the children were doing. But it seems like that would be to diminish the contribution that they actually made towards the end goal, that being the mother's breakfast in bed. Like if it were the case that the child was making their scrambled eggs, getting eggshells in it, and then he basically threw that out and then made his own scrambled eggs to put in its stead, that would be like, I don't know, it would be less good in some sense because the kid wanted to help contribute towards their mother's breakfast, and yet their actions were diminished and gotten rid of, even though they were, of course, poor. Like the child's attempt at scrambling eggs is not nearly as good as the father's attempt would be. But yeah, and so then the story ends where the father brings up the kind of bad breakfast to the mother, and she enjoys it because like, oh, this came from my children and my husband who loves me very much. And even though there's like burnt toast and crunchy eggs and things like that, there's still a lot of good that's being had there. that's even better than the good that would have been the case if the father had just made the perfect breakfast by himself and then sort of did it on behalf of the children. That's at least the sort of motivation I have for the Theodicy. And I want to argue that this story is comparable to God's relation to the world, where God could have created a perfectly ideal world solely of himself. But if he's going to populate that world with creatures, it would seem better for him to allow those creatures to have contributed towards the actual process that led to that eventually ideal world. But in doing so, that would require those creatures to first exist within a non-ideal world where things can go wrong, and there's no like limits to what sorts of things can go wrong, because each of the steps in the process of arriving at an ideal world is going to be very gradual, and like each step in the process is also something that God would want the creatures to contribute towards. So he's allowing these creatures, these fallible beings, to participate in each step in the eventual process of bringing about an ideal world, but it's going to come with a lot of flawed and poor attempts that end up failing for that whole process. But it's still going to be good by God's lights, because he's being generous to the creatures and allowing them the opportunity to participate in doing the very greatest thing that they could do, which would be like contributing towards the bringing about of an ideal world. So that's sort of the motivations behind the argument. I feel like telling a story is able to like get people to see the reasoning a lot more than like laying out a strict argument. So I'm glad you gave me the opportunity to sort of like do that for your audience.
No, yeah, I think story and narrative are really important. I think we utilize them all the time in all areas of our lives, and no, it's good to do that. This isn't a planned question, so we can skip over it if you don't want to answer it. But it'd be interesting to kind of,
It's fine.
I guess, try and get you to kind of go back to the days when you were first kind of looking at philosophy before you were kind of beginning to look to convert to Catholicism. Kind of potentially there was some sort of kind of darker days between the sort of Messianic Christianity and the sort of kind of Catholicism that you've landed in, where you were kind of doubting the goodness of God. I don't know. So if not, fair enough. But what would your gut reaction or gut intuition have been if you were listening to this podcast in those shoes, in the sort of darker days and moments? Like if you'd have heard somebody say the things that you're saying right now, John, what would have been your initial sort of knee-jerk reaction? Kind of like where would it have fallen down for you back then, I guess?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And while I have never been like an atheist explicitly, I guess in some sense, like I had taken, I'd considered like, well, maybe God is a sort of like very limited being, or maybe like a sort of emergent property of human consciousness or something like that, which is like a very, yeah, it's definitely not theism that I hold to currently. And so it's funny, like the problem of evil didn't really strike me as confronting when I was in that sort of periodic point before becoming Christian, so much as it has been after becoming Christian, and a sort of recognition of just how much evil there really is in the world. And so I'll sort of comment from both points, where, from the sort of agnostic position, I think that a consideration I'd have for this Theodicy story sort of backing it is a question of like, okay, yeah, that can make sense of why God might create an initially imperfect world, but it doesn't make sense of why there is this exact amount or degree of suffering and evil that we actually observe in the world. And so I think the person could agree to some extent to the Theodicy, and thinking that, yeah, God wouldn't just create heaven ex nihilo right off the bat, but maybe he would create a better world than this, but one that does still allow for the creatures within it to participate in the bringing about of that eventual ideal goal and the ideal good. And then from that point in which a more fleshed out understanding of just how much evil there is in the world, and has been given like all of evolutionary history, I think the question I'd have is to what extent the animals who suffer as due to the fact of evolution, and through their predatory natures, that they'll eat each other. How much is it that these animals are really participating towards this ideal good of like bringing about an ideal world? This seems not even comparable to the 2-year-old in the example, sort of like cracking the egg and mixing it up, because animals aren't like trying to build a breakfast for mommy. They're not trying to create an ideal world. They're just like cast into the world in a state of deprivation, where they have to struggle to survive, and they will undergo a significant amount of suffering and torture and pain, and from being eaten alive, and then struggling with starvation and all of that. And the question is, like, to what end are these creatures actually participating in the eventual ideal world that is supposedly being brought about? So those would be like the two questions I would have for me as the defender of this theodicy, given that sort of like point in my consideration at that time.
You did something beautiful just then, which very, very few people do, and that's is that the fact that you answered my question without then trying to answer your answer, which is great. A lot of people say that and they go, "But now and actually, yeah, cool, but we're going to get into that." So thank you, that was awesome.
Yeah,
very, very rare. People don't usually do that. I don't usually do that. So there you go. So
yeah,
I
we'll
want
get
to talk.
there.
Yeah, well. I want to talk about this idea of the ideal then. So you kind of obviously raise it kind of throughout the paper itself, and it's kind of defined as this sort of I guess ensuing only things worth having and nothing kind of worth avoiding. So kind of going after that which is worth getting, and leaving behind that which is worth avoiding. So I think it would be good to talk about this kind of this ideal world, like what if we are participating to get to this place, kind of what is that kind of, is it going to be this heaven that you mentioned before wasn't going to be kind of created ex nihilo, but is going to be brought into reality piecemeal? But what does that place look like in your eye, John?
Yeah, so I would say that the ideal world is a sort of misnomer, because it's not just there's not a singular ideal world that we could arrive at. There are a significant variety of ideal worlds that we could eventually arrive at. And so, in sort of drawing from this Theodicy's main line of reasoning, is the idea is that the creatures are participating in the type of ideal world we eventually arrive at. But so it's not the case that God has some sort of like preset thought in mind, where it's like, okay, this specific ideal world, that's the one I'm aiming for, and I'm going to create a world in which all the creatures eventually arrive at that ideal world. But it's actually, no, God is allowing creation to be a little bit more free in this regard, of like choosing and bringing about the particular ideal world that they will eventually arrive at. And so, yeah, I can't know precisely what sort of ideal end state of the world our contribution might eventually lead up to, but I can like lay out some general features of the world that would make sense, like that it features positive relationships between creatures and God. That's something that J.L. Schellenberg utilizes in his divine hiddenness argument. The idea that the highest end of rational agents is to be in a loving relationship with God, who is the highest good. So I'd imagine that that would be a feature in a world with a feature of an ideal world. And I think that an ideal world would also have the feature of like having some sort of causal conditions that led up to that world through the creature's participation, because I think of that as a sort of ideal good. But I don't want to like bake that into the notion of an ideal world. I want to basically rely upon, okay, my interlocutor, the person who denies God's existence, they're probably going to have in mind something like what an ideal world would look like, what sort of world God would be inclined towards bringing about. I'm more than willing to just sort of work with their intuitions about what the ideal world would be. Like maybe their idea is that an ideal world would be Kant's kingdom of ends, where all the individuals within that world are rational agents who treat one another as ends unto themselves and never as means unto an end. That's a sort of like aspect of an ideal world that we can sort of work with to make sense of the participation theodicy.
Okay, interesting. I'm so this is how I viewed it in the past. There's almost this sort of idea of the sort of beatific vision, sort of kind of complete union with God as this sort of Trinity that is already kind of whole, and we're allowed to partake in that. So we're almost kind of adopted into this sort of beatific vision, and we're going to kind of be in that kind of consistent state. And then, as you were speaking, I kind of thought as well about kind of Sam Harris wrote The Moral Landscape many years ago now, 2011 maybe, which again, he kind of talks about that as almost like a map surveying kind of a sort of world where there are peaks and there are valleys, and we might be ascending one peak, but actually there could be other peaks that you can get higher up on, and there's sort of limited peaks as well. I think it'd be interesting just to kind of dive into this just slightly. So do you think it's almost like we're going to have to go to different peaks and to kind of explore and to test stuff, or do you think there are quite a few peaks that will reach the sort of beatific vision, or would you even use the sort of word kind of or terminology beatific vision? Like how would you kind of, I guess, look at that side of it?
Yeah. So I would definitely use the term beatific vision, and would definitely want to say that it's a feature of an ideal world. And I'd want to, I guess, clarify as well that a beatific, like to attain a beatific vision, is to be in union with God, in a loving union with God. That is, and I'd want to say is also like in moral union of the will. So much like a marriage that can only really run if both parties in the marriage are like have the same end goals in mind or the same values. That's going to be the basis for a strong and lasting relationship. And so similarly, for an individual to be in a loving relationship with God, their moral will, or their will, is going to have to be in coordination with God's will, so that you won't have these sort of incommensurate desires and things like that. So I'd want to like bake that into the idea of the beatific vision as a sort of coordination of the will towards the highest end, or yeah. And then the other question you had about the moral landscape. So I think that there are going to be a variety of peaks on the moral landscape in which we could describe the world as being ideal, because it has only features that are worth having and no features that are worth avoiding. And that's going to apply to a lot of different possible worlds out there. And I don't know if like an ideal world would require like, okay, we attained this state of idealness, but like that other state of idealness would look better. So let's like diminish our world so that we can get back up to that other peak. I'd imagine that the ideal world would have these sorts of features to arrive at higher ideal states, but I don't know, maybe that's just a presumption I have in my part. It could very well be the case that there are certain goods that are incommensurate with one another, such that to have one necessarily requires lacking the other. And so you could have an ideal state of the world over here and an ideal state of the world over here, but it's not the case that you can move from one to the other without losing something in this one to get to that one. Yeah, that's an interesting thought I hadn't really considered. I guess I'd imagine that given God's omnibenevolence and omnipotence, he would be able to co-instantiate all of these multiple goods. But I mean, yeah, maybe that is a presumption on my part that these goods are always going to be commensurate with one another. It could very well be the case that even God could not co-instantiate certain incompatible goods. It is an interesting thought, but yeah, not one I'd really considered before.
No, that's interesting, and I guess kind of the way that when you read like Sam Harris's book, he, as you mentioned, then does talk about the fact that we might have to go through certain valleys to reach other peaks. Now, I'm not trying to endorse Sam Harris's book or say it's good or anything, but it's an interesting metaphor that I've used in other conversations.
Yeah.
But when I kind of hear Christians usually speak about kind of where we're going, it's usually the sort of kind of mountain sort of terrain where there are going to be cliff faces, there are going to be bits where you're going to have to go back a step or two to go up a few more steps. So rather than kind of there being lots of different peaks, there's one peak, we're all trying to get to the same point. But we're all going about it in different ways almost, or that sort of stuff, which I find to be helpful sometimes and kind of frustrating at other times. I don't know. I want to talk about the idea of kind of God's foreknowledge then. It's a question that people ask quite a lot, which is just simply kind of like, did God have the foreknowledge that the world he created was going to bring about the pain and suffering that conscious creatures like us experience? Now, I think you're going to say yes, and if you were to be in the position where there was which you used to hold, which is sort of a lesser God, a God that isn't fully powerful or fully knowledgeable or whatever, then potentially you would have said maybe not. But without putting words in your mouth, like I kind of feel like Catholicism says that God would have known this. But John, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so it's interesting because there are different camps even within Catholicism regarding God's foreknowledge. You could have a sort of simple view of foreknowledge, a sort of divine eternality view of God's foreknowledge. You could have a Molinist view of foreknowledge, or you could even theoretically be an open theist with regards to God's foreknowledge. I think that of those four options, the first three are going to be more in line with Catholic tradition, whereas the fourth one is probably going to be less in line. But as far as I know, it's not like been dogmatically declared anathema as of this point in time. So one could still be an open theist in that regard as well. And it's funny, I would probably be somewhat sympathetic towards a type of open theism that says that prior to creation, God would not know how the world would play out indeterministically, because there's just no fact of the matter about how something would happen indeterministically. That's a sort of contradiction, because if something will happen some way, that means it's determined to come about in that way. But to say that it will happen indeterministically is to say it's like it was determined and also not determined. So that's a contradiction in my mind. Molinists, I find a hard time understanding how God could know the contingent actions of free creatures prior to their existence, because I think that for an action to be performed by me, I must first exist. And so if I don't exist prior to creation, then I don't think God could know what I would freely do. I'm sympathetic towards, I probably lean most heavily on a sort of divine eternality view of God's foreknowledge, because God is a sort of like timeless, spaceless being. God is going to have access to all of time and space from his vantage point. Now, I don't think so there's a sort of like mix between open theism and the divine timeless view, in that like God will choose between what sort of worlds he wants to set things off as, but prior to his decision and the creation of that world, he won't know what the creatures within that world will do. But after having created, he will have an awareness of what they do, given that he has access to the entire timeline all at once. And then there's a simple foreknowledge view, which maybe makes, I don't have like a particular model of that, but it almost seems like God just like looks into the future and then he sees what's going on, but he himself is in time somehow. I think that sort of view makes a lot more sense when God is timeless rather than God being in time. But I guess it's not technically incoherent to say that I'm in time and I can see the future. Maybe it's just like B theory of time is true, that like, yeah, the future and the past coexist with one another. And so you could sort of use a telescope to see what's going on in the future somewhere. It has to be a very special telescope, of course. And the question was regarding like God's foreknowledge with regards to the animal suffering and the evils in the world. Like, would it be the case that God knows the exact sorts of evils that will befall a world? I think I'd want to say, being sort of sympathetic to that more open theistic attitude, is God would know beforehand what kinds of evils may occur within a world without knowing what precise evils shall occur within the world. Because the idea of the Participation Theodicy is that God creates a non-ideal world in which things can go wrong. And I'm understanding that in a sort of indeterministic fashion. Although you could theoretically say that it's a determined world that's eventually going to arrive at the ideal state. I myself am a libertarian, so I'm always more sympathetic towards indeterministic accounts of causation within the world. But I think that probably this theodicy doesn't rest upon that sort of libertarian account. So I'm always willing to sort of like reformulate the argument in line with whatever anyone's intuitions are regarding like causality, free will, and different things like that. If you're a compatibilist, I think that a compatibilist notion of the Participation Theodicy is coherent and can still work by my lights. And similarly, if you're a libertarian, if you're a Molinist, maybe even. So yeah, probably the hardest criticism I've gotten from fellow Christians is going to be from Molinists, because they would think that God foresees every single way in which a world could play out, even with the participation of creatures within leading up to that world. And then God would choose one of those worlds to instantiate. And so letting it all play out exactly as he foresaw it to be. And I think that diminishes the amount of participation on the part of the creatures, because it seems like God could have instead allowed the creatures to participate in the choosing of what way the worlds shall eventually play out. And so it does seem like on a Molinist picture, there is some good of participation that got prevented from occurring. and God did solely of himself, that being the choosing of which world he wanted to instantiate. And so that's where there's a bit of tension, I think, between my participation theodicy and a Molinist picture of the world. But I still think that, yeah, you could maybe be a Molinist and endorse the participation theodicy. It's just not going to be as effective, I guess, because like the participation theodicy rests upon the idea that of those things that would be good for God to do alone, it would be better for God to do that with the cooperation of creatures and the contribution of creatures. And so this is an instance in which, like, yeah, God's doing something on his own that he could have instead allowed other creatures, could have allowed creatures to participate in. Yeah, I don't know if I exactly covered the question that you had, but at least laid out some of my thoughts relating the topic of the question.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. And I guess, I mean, it's probably worth saying for those that aren't familiar, there's sort of kind of two sort of definitions that people tend to go down with evil. There's the sort of kind of natural evil, which you could include things like tsunamis or certain kind of plagues potentially. We won't go into sort of COVID-19 and that sort of whole conspiracy theory hypothesis, but you know there are things that could happen that are natural. There's also kind of moral evils, which would be agent-orientated evils. And I guess I kind of want to just push into sort of idea of sort of God's foreknowledge and sort of whether or not he's morally blameworthy. If you're a libertarian, you can quite easily turn around and say, well, actually, God isn't morally blameworthy for the moral evils that occur within the world because he's given us the ability to choose right from wrong through free will. And therefore, it's on us, rightly so, to make the right decision to move forwards. But then there's the sort of natural evil, and you could point to, you know, various animals, and you could say that their free will is massively diminished, and there are natural evils that affect them. I mean, you could say the same thing for humans, right? But the sort of natural evil camp seems to require more of God, I guess, in the sort of kind of foreknowledge and kind of answering kind of why that's happened. Why can a all-loving, all-powerful, all-good God allow these sort of natural evils to occur? Why can he put us in a world where actually it's just moral evils, and actually that's the sort of way that we play this out? I don't know, John, kind of what are your thoughts around the sort of the differentiation between these sort of natural evils and these moral evils?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. That it is a common understanding that natural evils are more difficult for various theodicies to render inert, given the fact that it's not the case that these are the products of non-divine wills. It's going to be directly a consequence of God's divine will that these natural evils can occur and shall occur given the conditions that he set up. Whereas if God were to create like moral agents, then it's like up to them whether or not they are going to act immorally. I still think there can be a concern for moral evils because we can still say that God created the conditions in which these moral agents have lasting effects upon other agents. Like God could have created moral agents whose intention to do evil never came to fruition. Rather, it just affected themselves somehow. Like God had all these angels, and then like, yeah, they had the freedom to will in accordance with the good or will in accordance to their own desires. And those that do will in contrast to the good, their intention is ineffectual. Like it's not the case that when a demon tries to possess somebody and cause them to harm themselves, that God just prevents that from taking place. But yet it's still the case that that demon like tries to do that thing. And so they are expressing free will on that part. It's just that God is sort of like preventing their free will to actually come to fruition. I think that most people assume that a moral account of evil is going to avoid the problem of God being on the hook for these things, when I don't think that's really the case. I think there is still aspects of God being on the hook to some extent, being there. And so, yeah, let's move over to natural evils, because, yeah, it is the case that if God were to create a world in a non-ideal state, wherein there will be creatures that can be brought about through natural selection, that there's going to be a lot of instances of animal suffering that can take place. And so God would foreknow that, because he's creating that sort of world. Like, there's no concern with like free will and how could he know this, because it's like, well, I'm creating a world in which this can occur. I know that I'm creating a world that is non-ideal initially, and being non-ideal, a lot of bad things can occur, and this is one of those bad things that I foresee shall very likely occur, or maybe definitely will occur. And so the question is like, well, is God going to be on the hook with regards to that sort of evil and make him sort of diminish his moral character? So there's this notion of morality that's related to this, that being what you're intending to do through your actions. And so the classic example is like, okay, suppose you're stuck at you're at a trolley, trolley track, and there's a switch that will allow you to switch the trolley track where it's going. And so a trolley runaway is careening towards 5 different individuals that are standing or are blocked somehow or trapped on the track, and they're about to be hit by that runaway trolley. And you can switch the lever so as to direct the trolley towards another track. Unfortunately, there's another single person on that other track. And so you can make the sort of moral calculus, like, look, it's better to save these 5 people because at least 4 people are saved comparatively, even though, yeah, there's still that one that's killed through this action. And it's not the case that I'm trying to kill this other person. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to save these 5 people. And an effect of that is going to be this one person is going to die. So similarly, the idea behind the participation theodicy is that it's not the case that God is intending to inflict suffering upon all these millions of animals, and billions, in fact. Rather, it's the case that God is trying to create an ideal world and trying to do so via a method or a means that allows the creatures within that eventual world to have participated in its eventually being brought about. And so long as that itself is a good intention on God's part, that will justify his decision in creating this world that is initially non-ideal, in which a lot of animal suffering can take place. And so the question is going to boil down to is okay, would it be justified for God to allow creatures, would it be justifiable for God to have this desire, this intention, and then act upon that so as to bring it about? Recognizing a consequence of his making that decision is going to be a significant amount of animal suffering or evils in general that can occur.
Trolley problems are a really fascinating one. When people usually speak about it, they kind of talk about these 5 on one track and 1 on the other track. And if the trolley's going kind of careering towards those 5, people often say that you are morally obliged to divert that trolley to go towards the 1. And there's sort of another example which I find really, really fascinating. So there's a single track, and there's 5 people on the single track, and there's a bridge over the track, and you're on the bridge with your friend. And your friend happens to be extremely large. So you can see this trolley is careering down the track. It's going to hit these 5 people. Are you morally obliged to push your extremely large friend onto the track from the bridge, knowing that doing so will stop the trolley and therefore save those 5 people? So it's still a 1 for 5 scenario, but actually there's something that's morally repugnant about deliberately pushing a human onto the track. If they're already on the track, it feels like it's a different story. I don't know. I can kind of see how that feeds into the theodicy and into kind of what you're saying a little bit, John. So I kind of pass it back to you and let you kind of play around with that a bit.
Yeah, no, it's a brilliant, bringing that up, because that seems like similar to the initial trolley problem, but it's still different in a lot of ways, because where people's moral intuitions would say, yeah, it's permissible to change the trolley track to hit that one person so as to avoid the 5, it's impermissible for me to push my fat friend down in front of the track to stop it and save those 5 people. Even though if you're doing a pure moral calculus, one person's dead and 5 people are saved. The difference maker, it seems, between those 2 circumstances is you're using someone as a means to an end in order to attain some sort of goal. And so this is where Elizabeth Anscombe has brought in what she calls the doctrine of double effect, the idea that action can be morally justified insofar as the intention behind the action and the means in which that intention has been expressed are justifiable in themselves. I don't know if that's an exact, but that's like how I'm understanding like an action is going to be morally justifiable. Because like, yeah, you could have the noble intention. I want to save those 5 people. But if your noble intention requires you to like treat an individual rational agent as like a mere means to an end, as almost like a barricade for an oncoming trolley, that's significantly, that's like a horrible attitude to take towards your fellow human beings. And so there's a sense in which a lot of non-consequentialists will argue that this is you shouldn't push the fat man over into the trolley, and the reason for that is because it would be, I guess, violating somebody's inherent rights. And even if it's the case that 5 people die as a consequence of that, that's still better than for me to violate their rights. And so the question then is like, okay, is God sort of treating animal suffering as a fat man to arrive at his end goal? Is he treating animals as these sort of like mere means to his end of the eventual idealization of the world? And I want to argue that no, rather, God, even in allowing creatures to exist in a world in which they will suffer privation and be injured and suffer pains and loss and death and heartache and things like that, God is doing so with the consideration of them as individuals and what their goals would be given their knowledge. So like it could be the case that so there's something known as a do not resuscitate clause for people that if I undergo cardiac arrest, don't save me. I'm an organ donor. Just save my organs and then send those out. And so there's a consideration like, yeah, normally it would be appropriate for you to save somebody if they're dying. But if they have a do not resuscitate, then like, okay, under consideration of what their intentions are or what their desires are as an individual, I'm going to refrain from doing that. Even though because they're unconscious, they don't have that active desire in themselves right now. It's just something that's part of who they are as a person. And so similarly, we could say that maybe it's not the case that a fawn in the wild has this innate desire that like, oh, I want to be a participant in God's eventual creation of the ideal world. But God could still recognize that afterwards, after the world has been idealized and this fawn is able to enjoy that world, this fawn would consent to the fact that it was used as a means to an end. And it's in line with its consent, similarly to how it may be in line with a person's consent to be used as an organ donor, to like refrain from saving them. Now, in the case of the fat man, it's very unclear that this fat man would have consented to being used as a barricade for the trolley. It seems like he was probably anti-receptive to that. But if it was, I don't know, if they had talked to you beforehand, like, hey, look, if I'm ever in the way, if I'm ever in the opportunity to be pushed in front of a trolley, I give you full consent to do that. Maybe then it would make sense to sort of push them over. And so, yeah, I want to say that God's not just using animals as a means to his eventual ideal end that he has in mind, but is actually taking into consideration what sorts of desires those animals would have if they could consent to these sorts of circumstances. And that's where he isn't treating them as mere means to an end, but ends unto themselves. In a similar way that we might treat an unconscious agent as an end unto themselves, even though they don't have any active desires regarding how their body should be treated. We know about them that they would want to have their organs transplanted to other people. And so, yeah, I do think that, yeah, the fat man problem for the trolley problem is related to the problem of evil and animal suffering. And I think it does require saying that God has the interests of the animals in mind and takes those into consideration in his decision making. And I think his justification is that, yes, these animals would consent to being participants in the eventual creation of the ideal world. After and he could know this given, I don't know if he could know this given a sort of like knowledge of what they will eventually consent to, unless that was a sort of determined fact. But I think it's more so like a sort of hypothetical consent, that God recognizes that were they capable of consenting to this, they would have consented. And so that gives me a justification for allowing it to occur. Yeah.
That's really interesting. I mean, we're going down a tangent, but I think it's well worth hammering through. So I'm just going to carry on. Basically, we can jump back to questions in due course. So I guess there are many. So say that you have a creature that is able to make decisions. I don't know, like dolphins, octopus, dogs. These things are pretty conscious. They're pretty smart. They're pretty good at kind of saying yes or no. Dogs I know very well, and they definitely tell you when they don't want to do something. So if a creature is able to understand, I mean, you could say human, right? So there's to make it really easy, a human knows that God exists. They know that their suffering is partaking in kind of moving towards this idealization of the world. You could still say that actually the creature at that point of having say they're a fawn or they're a human stuck in a wood burning to death, that they aren't kind of enacting that sort of idealization. They're just suffering for the sake of suffering. There's almost like there is some suffering. Say there's like 20% of suffering that's going to give you the movement towards idealization, and there's 80% which is just mindless, non-substantial suffering that doesn't get you to the sort of goal that we're trying to get to. It could be thought through possible that actually the creature might very well consent to that 20%, but the 80% they could very well not consent to, because it pushes you above and beyond what they're willing to go through and take. Now, the way that I could imagine answering this question is, so the question is why, like, does that make sense? And why would it make sense for suffering to be so global if actually it's only 20% that's getting us there? And the way that I would begin to kind of go about answering is, when you enter into the game, you are in the game. There is no way for you to kind of get around it or kind of skirt through the edges. You can't just accept the 20%. You have to accept that you're in a set parameter which is going to potentially bring about suffering in a horrendous way, given where your life might go. And actually, because there are moral agents and there are natural events, you could be forced into a forest fire through no decision of your own and therefore suffer. Actually, what you're consenting to is the whole picture, and that's for the 20% rather than just the 20%. Is that how you'd go about kind of looking at that one, John?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And yeah, the whole idea behind what a non-ideal world would look like is one in which things do not operate in a perfect accordance with God's will. And so that's going to mean that there's a lot of instances of genuinely gratuitous suffering which has no causal contribution towards some eventual greater good down the line. Rather, this suffering is a consequence of some state of affairs that God is justified in creating. And so, yeah, so it is an interesting, I guess, discussion within philosophy of religion, where some people will define gratuitous suffering in a very theologically laden definition, whereas like gratuitous suffering is any sort of evil or suffering that an all good, all powerful, all good God, all good, all powerful, all knowing God would not allow to occur. So there's like some notion that's very heavily theologically laden. But I think that we can like understand gratuitous suffering in a more theologically neutral sort of way, in talking about, okay, a gratuitous suffering is some sort of instance of suffering that plays no causal role in the eventual bringing about of some greater good. And I think my theodicy can make sense of why there is that type of suffering without saying that there is any of the other type of gratuitous suffering. Like, that definition of gratuitous suffering I gave in a sort of theologically neutral way can be made sense of on my theodicy, so long as if the theodicy actually works. Whereas I think that most people want to say, when they're saying that gratuitous suffering is incompatible with God's existence, they're talking about that heavily theologically laden notion of suffering. And so, I really appreciate like what you're talking about, how like the idea of you're cast into a world in which it's non-ideal, but it's in the process of eventually becoming ideal. That's going to have as a consequence all of these extraneous problems and dilemmas that take place that aren't really part of the eventual, like, these aren't like necessary steps in that very goal. It's just possibilities that could occur given the non-ideal nature of the world. And so you can have legitimately gratuitous sufferings that occur, of like a fawn burning in a forest fire. That it's not the case that Fawn's death was absolutely necessary for the great good of an ideal world. Rather, it's just the ideal world needed as part of its process. That ideal world, in order to have had creatures contribute towards it, needed to have non-ideal steps in that process, which those non-ideal steps in the process would have these sorts of possible outcomes, that being like fawns burning in forest fires. But it's not a necessary entailment that it's going to come about. Now, if it were the case that God prevented all of these other things, then he's just already created an ideal world, because he's like, there's not any creaturely contribution here, because like anytime something's about to go bad, much like the father in the example, he's just stepping in and like preventing that from actually taking place. So I think I answered your question there. That's the thing. I'll get off into tangents and then like, okay, I want to circle back, but then by the time I circle back to saying the thing that I wanted to say, I'm not sure if I actually answered the thing that you wanted me to answer. So I'm sorry if
it's good.
neglected.
No, I love the rabbit holes. I love the tangents. And yeah, you're absolutely right. I get lost all the time. I think like, what am I meant to be asking the person next? Like, I'm just talking. This is not good. That's funny. Okay, so I want to talk kind of about what it is and isn't logically possible for God to put into action, and then kind of why he'd wants to make those things actionable. So that's going to sound weird, but let me kind of ask both these questions. So I guess people Catholics, Christians in general would kind of say that it isn't logically possible for God to have an action that isn't going to be positive in effect in the long run. So given that, God has created world is in existence, evil is a possible thing, but actually the positive effect is going to be this idealized state eventually. So would you say for God to be all-knowing, all-powerful, purely good in character, that the actions that this God performs have to necessarily and logically be positive in effect?
So I think I would want to say that, because like in my understanding of God's omnibenevolence, I want to say that God would only ever do that which would be good to do. I guess there's a sense in which we could say that there are certain actions that have no positive effect, but are still like good to do. If you were maybe like a strict deontologist or something like that, like maybe this, like the mere intention to do something good is a good in and of itself. But whether or not that intention comes to fruition isn't a necessary component. So like we could say that's X is a good guy because he always wants to help people. But given his disabilities or something like that, he's incapable of helping anybody. And I think that we can still say that he's a good guy, even though his intentions are never able to actually be brought to fruition. Now, that's just a way to sort of like characterize, I guess, omnibenevolence without saying that, yeah, it requires the exact thing that he desired to come to fruition. Of course, God being omnipotent, all of his desires or intentions would be coming to fruition, unless, of course, it would be a contradiction for the thing that he desires to always come to fruition. Like if it's the case that God wants us to freely accept him as our Lord and Savior or something like that, then it can't be the case that God makes it to be the case, and then that actually does become the case because God desired for it. That would be a contradiction, I think, because it's to be freely done by us, it would have to be coming from us. But if God's the one that sort of initiated it such that it must occur, then it's not coming directly from us. It's coming through us by proxy in a sort of sense. The question, I did want to get back to the main part of the question that you had. But that was just like a minor rabbit trail regarding like, well, is it really necessary to say that God's an all good God must have only positive effects, right? Yeah, that was the primary question.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think that an all good God must always have justifiable reasons for their actions. And if one of those actions would have deleterious effects or bad effects, so long as that action was justifiable, then God would also be justifiable. So it's not the case that the only things that God could do are things that would lead to a positive effect. There could be things that God can do that will eventually and ultimately lead to an overall positive effect. But in the process, include a lot of detrimental effects like that, being suffering and pain and heartache and grief and different things like that. But it would just require that God would be justified to perform that action. And I think, given the sort of like logic of the Theodicy, is that God's allowing creatures to participate in the bringing about of an ideal world is that sort of justifiable reason that God would have to create a world in which there are bad effects that can come into fruition.
I want to invite you to join our community on Locals. There is a range of free and supporter-only benefits to check out. On Locals, you can ask guest questions, access the reading plan to prepare for upcoming conversations, get early access to all the full-length video and audio versions of each episode, and meet like-minded followers of the show. The link is in the description, and I hope to see you there. Okay, that's really interesting. And I guess the next two questions kind of just carry on from that. I think I'm trying to get us somewhere which will be interesting, I think. So I guess the next thing then to say is there's this all-knowing, all-powerful being who's purely good in character. So is it logically consistent to think that this being could add to its goodness as an a priori state? Like what is it doing as it's beginning to necessitate these positive intentions?
Yeah. So there's this argument from non-God objects, which sort of argues that God is a perfect being. And so God existing of himself would constitute a perfect world. And so for God to create anything other than himself would be create something that's not perfect. And so God would be introducing imperfection to the world through creating, thereby being a like bad action on God's part. And of course, God being omnibenevolent, God would never do some bad action of diminishing a perfect world to an imperfect world. And so God would never create anything at all. That's an argument that can be leveled against omnitheists. I think that this argument is flawed, and I think a good way in which to see the flaw in this argument is to invert it. So let's consider an all bad being, an omnimalevolent deity, who is wholly of himself the worst possible being that you can imagine. And now we can ask ourselves, would this omnibenevolent being be inclined to create creatures other than himself to suffer horribly? And it seems like to be fully evil, this evil deity would have like reason to create these to create these creatures that will suffer. And so this sort of line of argumentation would also apply to that. Like, oh, this deity is supposed to be the worst possible deity that you can imagine. That means that deity by itself would constitute the worst possible state of the world. And so by adding new things to it, that world, that being like other people suffering horribly, he's making the world better in some sense, because it's no longer that worst possible state of the world. It's now there's something other than the worst possible being in that world, that being a less than worst possible being. And so that's made the world better by creating. And I think that's definitely flawed. Like, if a being were to create a creature besides itself that is suffering, and that's the entirety of its existence, that would be a bad thing for that thing to do. And it's not the case that he makes the world better by doing that bad thing that has such a bad consequence. He's actually doing something bad. And so I think that if we think that the omnimalevolent being would create something other than himself, then similarly should we think that an omnibenevolent being would create something other than itself, so long as the thing that it's creating would be good for it to create. Like, I think that God doesn't instantiate all goodness within himself. He is the highest good, and he has only good attributes and has all those attributes to the highest degree. But it's not the case that God has the property of having a child. And I think having a child is a good property to have. And so by God sort of creating things other than himself, he's allowing more goods to be exemplified than just himself. It's not the case that God instantiates the good of forgiveness in himself because there's no one for him to forgive or no one for him to be forgiven by. And so God creates creatures in which they can exemplify that sort of good. But even like, I don't know, forgiveness is kind of weird because it sort of like requires an evil. And so potentially requires an evil at least. But anyway, yeah, I think that idea that God might not create anything because he is a perfect being is flawed. And I think we can see the flaw when we mirror that sort of argument with under consideration of an omni-malevolent being. And I don't know, like, do you I'm sure you probably find the argument from non-God objects somewhat plausible. And so I'm wondering if this sort of like mirrored version of that argument gives you any sort of reason to like rethink that argument.
It's a great question. I think we might reach our first contention. I don't know. We'll see. So I guess it comes down to kind of how we're defining the beatific vision. So the way that I've always thought about it, and the way that I tried to describe it to Philip Goff when I had him on the show for the second time, was this sort of idea. There's this sort of kind of triangle of Father, Son, and Spirit, which are in consistent communion, and this thing is already perfect. It doesn't need to add anything into it. It is literally kind of perfection, right? And we're kind of invited to partake in that because that's adding goodness to us. But I think kind of when you kind of, if you kind of just define God as this single entity which is loving and it's going to be participating and asking other people to come into it, and then you flip it and say there's an evil God that's going to be creating evil deliberately for evil, but it's almost like the evil God version that you're saying is just trying to create more evil, where God is trying to it's almost like the beatific vision is claiming that God is trying to bring us into this kind of this triangle of perfection. So I guess
okay, so then we can just modify the example to say that there is the hellish reality that is the worst possible being, this malevolent deity. Like it experiences the entire, like an infinite degree of suffering within itself. And he's like, you know what? I want to make this a little bit worse. I'm going to create like 5 other people that are also going to experience the suffering, and I'm going to draw them into me to experience my own inner life, which is hell for these people. And it seems like if we were to sort of like modify the argument in that way, it still seems like that evil deity, if it's truly evil, would have reason or would be motivated to perform that evil action of creating other creatures that would participate in the life of itself, which is a horrible life to live.
Interesting. I mean, there's sort of 2 ways that we can push forward from this then. So the first way, and I'll try and remember them both before my mind goes. The first way is, I guess it's not always obvious on its face why adding something to something that is already in a perfect state makes it better or is a bad or good thing to do. Like that feels like it doesn't make sense. I know a lot of people say that's obviously true, that adding something to perfection is going to be a good thing, but perfection as defined is already in that state. So adding something to it is not going to make it better or worse. It's already perfect. Let's just hammer that one through first. Like, kind of, how would you? I mean, I guess let's use the evil example.
Well, okay.
Okay, go on.
Okay, yeah, just from there, like I think that there's going to be a strict difference between a perfect being and a perfect world. So a perfect being would be one who cannot be improved in any way, whereas a perfect world would also be one in which it cannot be improved in any sort of way. And so by creating another being besides God, God is not improving himself because he already has all of the good-making attributes to the highest degree. Like it's not the case that by creating somebody else besides himself that they're making him better in some sort of sense. Rather, the state of affairs is being made better by adding another thing to it. And so that's where I'd want to sort of like make that distinction between a perfect world and a perfect being. Like, yes, it's true that God would be the only thing that exists in a world all by himself, but that doesn't mean that the world that he exists within is perfect. It just means because that world can have more things added to it. It can be improved in certain respects because there are certain goods that are not exemplified. There's many things that could be added to it, but there's nothing that could be added to God. And so that's why there is a difference, even in a world in which God is the only object that exists within that world, that it's going to mean that the world itself is perfect. Similarly, we can like move back to the example. It's like, okay, we can make a distinction between a worst possible being and a worst possible world. And so the worst possible being cannot be detrimented in any way. it's already at the lowest level of existence in its own mental states and all of that. But a world can be made worse by adding more people to suffer within that world. And so that's why a world in which an evil deity all by itself exists is not going to be the worst possible world. It's going to be a bad world for sure, because the only thing in that world is a deity that like lives a hellish existence. But it can still, that world can be made worse by adding more people to also live a hellish existence in conjunction with him.
Boom, microphone drop. So let's keep pushing into this then. So I think this is a really, really interesting one. So it's almost like you're talking. So I'm going to use the example of wine and a wine connoisseur. Now there's a word for that person. I don't know what it is. So let's just use the word wine connoisseur or the phrase wine connoisseur. So you've got this perfect wine. Like it's definitively, it is the best possible wine. There's no wine that is better than this. Pick your favorite wine. Imagine that is the most perfect wine. And it's almost like this wine is able in and of itself to produce a wine connoisseur who's going to be able to enjoy this beverage fully. They're going to have the correct palate, the correct aptitude, the correct everything to season, enjoy, drink, and make full of this unending perfect bottle of wine. So that's kind of feels like what you're saying, that this thing is able to create something that is going to be substantiated. But I think the issue that I can see people raising their hand and going, but come on, is we're defining God as already being all-knowing, all-powerful, and purely good. He is almost perfection, or people would kind of define God as perfection, right? This thing that is complete. And I think I don't have an issue saying that God is going to want to create something to add more stuff to it, but it kind of almost feels like a lot of people look at this and they'll turn around and say, this thing already is everything. Creating this other stuff that's also great is cool, but it doesn't bring about anything that's going to be as good or as whole or as complete, because we're defining this thing as the fulfillment, the substantiation, the completion of everything. So I guess you kind of got to ask, why would this thing that is already complete have to bring about something? It's not going to add anything to it. It might add something else that's possible to be raised in goodness. But that feels like we're kind of just saying this thing could create something. It doesn't need to, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, no. That is very good, because that's a typical doctrine of classical theism, that God is fully sufficient in and of himself. He doesn't need anything besides himself in order to be complete. And so for many people, the idea of like an action must have some sort of motivation drawing from our beliefs as well as from our innate desires. And that innate desire is going to be something that is a lacking on our part. Like the reason that somebody decides to give to charity is not just because I believe that it would help other people that are in need. Rather, there's also some desire in me. I want to be a good person. And so because I'm lacking that, I have a desire of this thing. Like I feel really bad. I want to feel like I'm a good person. That's why I'm going to give to charity. And that's how many people like think about actions and motivations and all of that. But it is difficult for like how to make sense of that account of rational decision making for a being who is fully sufficient in and of itself. Because God is not lacking anything and doesn't have any sorts of desires to fulfill, because he's fully of himself. So what would motivate him to create beings other than himself? And it seems like it would have to be some sort of like purely altruistic motivation. It's not done for his own sake. It's done for the sake of others. So maybe this sort of rests on a strong view of moral realism, maybe the idea that you can have reasons to do things that are not inherently selfish. At least, maybe it's the case that humans can never do that because we're inherently selfish. Everything that we do will be like tainted by that desire for our own needs because we're built from desire. But for some being like God who has no desires, he would, I would say that he would still have motivation to do certain things, given his recognition that it would be good if they were done, without saying that it would be good for him that be done, because he cannot be improved in any sort of way. And if we wanted to bring it back to the evil God idea, this evil deity isn't going to be made better by creating other creatures. He's going to retain his fully hellish state of existence, but he's still like motivated given what we mean by omni-malevolent, that they are disposed to always do things that are evil. Always only ever do things that are evil. And so by creating creatures besides itself to suffer alongside of him, he is doing something evil. But his doing so isn't coming from a sort of lacking, I guess. It's difficult because, like, yeah, we normally do things out of a desire because we want to do them. But like, what's the sort of the way of articulating this like evil God is that he's like disposed to do these evil things, but he's not made happier by doing so. He's already stuck at a state of hellish existence, but he's still evil in his moral character. And so that's why he does things that are also going to be evil. So I don't know. Like, I'm wondering if your intuitions regarding God's sort of refrain from creating things besides himself similarly applies to the omni-malevolent deity. Or does it make sense to you that an omni-malevolent deity would create creatures to suffer alongside of it by making the world worse? Would that be something that an evil being would very likely do?
It's a really good question. So I think an evil being, if there was an omni-malevolent being, that being would create a situation where love was possible, but that it was only there to make the evil more real. That you can imagine goods being introduced, created deliberately to bring about worse suffering and worse pain. I think I know Stephen Law goes into this a little bit in a few of his books and his podcasts and stuff. I guess the differentiation between the two of these is I wouldn't imagine and this just could be because of how I viewed God historically from my kind of upbringing within a Christian framework, a sort of evil God. Say there's a sort of kind of classic Trinitarian view of this evil God, them wanting to bring participants into full evilness, into a purely evil state. I would imagine them consistently maintaining a juxtaposition between love and evil, or goodness and evil, deliberately, because that's going to bring about known full-fledged evil. So I guess if you were then to kind of flip it back to kind of what we're talking about, it kind of feels like, does God need there to be suffering to have good? That's kind of where I'm left with. And that would obviously leave a very bitter taste for you and for me in the sort of God idea. So kind of where would you take that to from that point?
Yeah, so like my whole notion of an ideal state of a world is something that's good in and of itself, and it has nothing that would be bad to it, that is worth avoiding. And so I do think that, yeah, there are states of affairs that are good and fully good that don't depend upon there being any sort of evil, contrast to that sort of like view, yeah, that's sometimes laid out by theodicists in saying that God creates us in a world in which there's a lot of suffering so that we can come to appreciate heaven much more so than we would have otherwise. And I don't really sort of buy into that sort of line of reasoning. Kind of what you've brought up before here is how God, if he has the beatific vision within himself, there's no suffering in God. Now, I am sort of putting on my classical theist hat in order to say that, but I think any sort of view of God as being the best possible being should say that there's no suffering in God, because suffering is intrinsically bad to undergo. And so it's better for God to never suffer in himself. He could have other reasons for suffering, maybe, but never, like, there would be never reasons, like, in virtue of the suffering for him to do so. Okay, so yeah. Sure, the question was, like, would it be necessary for God to sort of like create evil so that the highest goods could be attained? And I'd want to say, well, I guess in some sense, because my theodicy does talk about how, God could have created the ideal state of worlds, even with creatures within it, fully ex nihilo, right off at the snap of the fingers. And I'd want to say that action by God could be, there's another action that God could do that would have that same effect, eventual effect, but would be better for God to do, that being the God allowing creatures to participate in that. And it's going to require that those creatures exist in an initially non-ideal state of the world. And I guess the difference maker is maybe that in a non-ideal state of the world can have genuinely gratuitous suffering, where the evil in suffering within that world isn't strictly necessary for the eventual good that's being brought about. It's genuinely gratuitous, as I've sort of brought up before. Whereas on many models of greater good theodicies, it rests upon the presumption that the evils and the suffering that occurs in the world are necessary for the greater good that's being brought about. Like the idea of soul building. It requires that you first must suffer injustice so that you can exhibit the virtue of resilience, I guess, to injustice or something like that. And so that's a type of virtue that can only be exhibited through an evil taking place. And so on a soul building theodicy, they'd want to say that God would create creatures in a world in which they will suffer injustices so that their patience can be tested and they can so that they can like build a stronger moral character in this regard, or they can exhibit these sorts of moral virtues. And like that's a different theodicy than the one I'm sort of defending, in which there are evils that are genuinely gratuitous, whereas it seems like on those sorts of greater good theodicies, all of the evils that occur in the world are actually good in some sense, the fact that they occur. And so it gives reason to almost have a sort of moral paralysis with regards to like whether or not that evil should be prevented or mitigated. Because, if it's good that people suffer injustice so that they can exhibit a virtue of patience, then should we try to be making a just society? Because in making a just society, that's going to prevent people from actually exhibiting the virtue of resilience against injustice. That injustice is faring against them. And so, yeah, it raises this sort of like moral consideration of like, okay, if God wants us to exhibit all these moral virtues, and these moral virtues require there to be a lot of evil and injustice in the world, I guess we should not stop the evil and injustice in the world. We should let it be, because that's how we do what God wants us to do. And that's a worry that I have for a lot of greater good theodicies, especially like the soul building theodicy and others. I just find it. I can get some of the motivation to these sorts of theodicies, but I think that this as a consequence to that just makes it untenable, unless it gets heavily modified to bear some sort of resemblance to my theodicy. It's kind of like an opinion that I have. Is like most theodicies basically require an acceptance of participation as a sort of intrinsic good in order to succeed, like a sort of free will defense or a soul building theodicy or something like that. But once you accept participation as an intrinsic good, that can give you an account of the evils in the world without having to rely upon these other added assumptions. And so it's like, well, just stick with the simpler theodicy here instead of having to bake in all these other elements of like, there's a fall theodicy that happens, but it's not mankind's fall. It's actually angelic fall. And then they like created evolution and things like that. It's like, okay, well, that's a pretty complicated theory. And it seems like you don't need to have it be that complicated in order to like give an account, especially given the fact that the presumption that you're making that participation is an inherent good is already going to allow for that, is going to be able to provide an account for all those sorts of evils that you're trying to make an account for. Yeah, sorry for that little rant.
No, it's really interesting. So I guess the final thing to say on this section, that we can put a bow on it, and we can kind of, I'm sure it's going to crop up again, but we can kind of move on to the other questions. So I guess this is going to help us kind of mirror mirror the sort of perfectly good God. So there's an omni malevolent God who is, obviously, i.e. all evil. They have the two options. They can, one, create pure evil, actualized other than itself, and invite that thing to be part of it. So that's kind of coming together of these two things, this purely ideal world, which is for them evil because they are pure evil, or they could create something that has love, and then these creatures can participate within this world to get to this actualized state of evil. What are these creatures going to benefit from then? How are these creatures going to benefit from being able to get involved with this state into
Uh-huh.
the purely evil state? Like, what is it that we're saying? Because then we can obviously we can easily flip that to kind of what we're saying we get from doing it. Is it just character? Is it just moral aptitude? Is it just a desire to partake in it? Like, is that what we're trying to get from this?
Yeah, so if I was to like mirror my participation theodicy for the evil god challenge, I would say that the evil god is going to has a desire to create an uh, what would be the opposite of ideal? Be like a perfectly evil state of affairs. And so that perfectly evil state of affairs would have only things that are worth avoiding and nothing that's worth having it worth attaining. And so this evil god would be motivated to create that world and could do so solely of itself, ex nihilo, with like an infinite amount of persons stuck in that state of suffering and hating all of it. But because this evil deity wants to have creatures participate, like share in the evilness of creating such a horrible world, that evil deity would create an initially non perfectly evil state of affairs in which there are some good things that can occur as a consequence of the imperfectly evil way that the world is. And so that's how the evil god theorists could like account for why there are goods that occur in the world. And it's using a sort of mirror of my theodicy to make sense of like, okay, well, here's why there could be these sorts of evils that could, or these goods that could occur. I don't know if that was exactly the question that you're getting at, but it is something I've sort of considered. Like, okay, yeah, could my theodicy just be flipped for the evil god theodicist as well? And I think, yeah, it seems like I'm utilizing these sorts of terms that can be perfectly flipped and made sense of in that way. And yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting as well. And you're looking for a different word from purely ideal, but I guess if the God is malevolent, a purely ideal world for said God would be a purely evil world, which is kind of yeah, breaks your mind a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay, so I want to move on a little bit then. So I mean, that was obviously really, really interesting. It's going to crop up again. There's a few sort of kind of example questions towards the end that we're going to get into, so that's going to be great. But I think I guess I want to kind of ask the question, kind of, why do we think that creatures could create an ideal world, and that I guess that it would reach an ideal peak. Like, why is there this thought that it's possible that we can partake? It's almost like that's assumed, but why is that assumed, John?
Yeah, so if you buy into the notion of God being omnipotent, that's going to mean that God could create anything that is logically coherent. And yeah, there can still, so basically God could create creatures that have the causal ability to contribute towards the next step, which contributes to the next step that eventually attains an ideal state of the world. Given God's omnipotence, he can just sort of like change things if he needs to, so that it now will become possible again. And so there's maybe a bit of like fiddling in that regard, where God's like, okay, the creatures are all about to go extinct right now. I'm going to make it so that that doesn't actually happen, and so that the causal contribution can continue to occur. And then there's the other sort of questions like, well, if we are finite creatures that are very fallible in our decision making and in our actions that we perform in the world, how is it that these fallible and imperfect actions can lead to a perfect state of the world? Um, and I think that, yeah, it's also going to sort of like rest upon uh, God's ingenuity, I guess, in some respect, where like, yeah, the even imperfect actions can be used towards a greater good down the line. Um, I guess we can sort of, going back to the analogy of the breakfast in bed, is like, yeah, the child was trying to like make eggs and then burnt them or something like that, and it's like that itself was like a poor attempt, but it had an end at the end, or the eventual end at result was that the mother had breakfast in bed for her with her children, which she really enjoys, and she considers that an overall win. Um, and so, yeah, then there's the other question, which I think is also relevant, is like, to what extent are animals really contributing towards the eventual idealization of the world, given that they're not capable of rationally understanding the part that they play in the causal mechanisms of the world. And so, in what sense are they really participating here? Because what we generally mean by participation is some sort of like coordination of will towards some end. But if the creatures themselves aren't really have a will in mind of like, let's build an ideal world, then it's not like they're really participating. And I think that, yes, that is one notion of participation. I think it's maybe like the highest notion of participation, the idea that, yeah, two individuals are of a common mind, and so they set out to bring about some goal because they both have that in mind and they're going to work together to bring about that goal. But there's also a lesser form of participation where there's a coordination of not so much will, but maybe a coordination of desires in some respect, where we might bring up the analogy of a sheep farmer and his sheep. Sorry, a sheep farmer and his sheepdog, where that sheepdog has been trained to congregate sheep into an area out to pasture or to bring them back in and things like that. And it's very likely the case that that sheepdog has no understanding of what those sheep are being raised for, their wool and all of that, probably their mutton as well. But that dog is purely just doing what it thinks would make it a good boy. Like that dog is just trying to be a good boy. It like has certain desires to be appreciated by its owner, which is a noble enough sort of desire for the dog to have. But it has no real understanding of why is it hurting sheep. It doesn't know what role sheep have in the global economy and things like that. But yeah, that dog would still be participating, in my mind, towards this higher end of like, yeah, the good of wool and mutton and different things like that. And so that dog is still contributing towards that ideal good, or it's not an ideal good, but it's just a general good, even though it doesn't have the rational faculties to be aware of that sort of good. And so similarly, I think that God, in order to allow creatures to participate in the eventual idealization of the world, doesn't require that God like provide them with supernatural knowledge of what their role is going to be in that eventual good, ideal state of the world, but rather just requires that those creatures have some sort of innate desires that they're acting upon, and those innate desires are contributing in some sense towards that eventual idealization, or at least are parts of the process of that is required for that eventual idealization. Because, like I said, there could be genuinely gratuitous evils that can occur, and so that's going to be an aspect of still participation in some respect. Like it's not the case that a chimp or a proto-hominid has sex with another proto-hominid with the understanding that this is going to give rise to irrational animals in the future. But it's still something that they see as a good to do. Like they're instinctually driven towards reproduction, and they're deriving pleasure from that. And so they have a motivation to bring about this end without even recognize the fullest extent of what that end would be. Like if we consider rational animals to be good things that exist, then it's the case that these proto-hominids were contributing towards that good end without even recognizing it. And there's a sense in which they were doing so intentionally, if they even had intentions, but maybe like from an aspect of desire. And so there is some aspect of participation that's there, even if it's not the highest form of participation that is even better, but it's still part of that process. Yeah.
It's really interesting. I guess I would question whether it's coherent to think that something that starts out in a natural, non-ideal state, and what I mean by that is something that's caused, or a causal reality due to the Big Bang, and has been brought about through the process of evolution, so that we have biological matter going about. So this that's what I define as a natural, non-ideal state, kind of can reach a sort of pure ideal state. I think kind of if we just were to understand the age of our sun, it's halfway through its lifespan, so it's going to burn out in the next X billion years. We would need to have moved off planet. I can imagine us beginning to understand how we can build better defense systems against tsunamis, how our moral capabilities move on, how we begin to populate other planets, X, Y, Z. But span the time frame out as long as you want. Eventually, we're going to end up in the heat death of the universe, and unless physics and kind of our understanding of the solar system and how things have come about is wrong. So I guess at some point throughout this sort of causal chain, there's going to need to be a non-natural intervention. You kind of mentioned this, like these guys are going to wipe themselves out.
Mm-hmm.
I'll step in at this point and kind of stop that from taking place. So I guess why is this intervention, to put it into a kind of word people understand, going to happen here rather than here? Why is there sort of this non-supernatural thing happening to bring us into existence, and then all of a sudden supernatural is going to need to come in to, I guess, substantiate and continue this purely ideal state? Because if we were to take the idea of kind of us entering into God's abode, my house has many rooms and you will have a room, this thing is going to be eternal as far as I can tell. And I guess that's the sort of element I'm trying to get to here, John, is how does eternity get slotted into this picture when it starts off as a very finite thing?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. Yeah, it is a dilemma, or because like finite creatures with limited capacities are not going to be able to bring about a world in which it is eternal, because they just don't have the faculties for doing that sort of thing. And so the idea of the participation theodicy doesn't require that every single good within an ideal state of affairs is brought about by imperfect creatures. Rather, it's that these imperfect creatures were able to contribute to the features of that world. And I think the point is that, yeah, there's certain features of an ideal world, like the fact that people live forever within it, is going to be something that would require God to contribute towards, because it's not the sort of thing that creatures could contribute towards. And so when there are certain goods that only God could bring about, then that would make sense for why God would bring about those things. But there's still going to be the fact of like, well, God could have done it by himself off the bat, but there might be features that could have been brought about through creatures beforehand. And so which would be better? Well, it would be the one where creatures contributed beforehand and then God basically completed. So the idea is that like creatures can have a significant causal role in the production of things that is done imperfectly, of course. And then God, once they've reached their pinnacle, their max, basically, God can reach down and sort of pull it up even more, because that's a thing that only God can do. It's not something that creatures plus God could do. I mean, in a sense, it's creatures plus God doing it, because like they've brought up this thing, and then God reaches down and lifts it up even higher. And so, yeah, that's a way in which to make sense of why there would be creaturely contribution, even if it's eventually in the end going to be supernatural. There's going to be have to be some sort of supernatural intervention in order to bring it up to its highest state. And so, yeah, that's the idea. And I think it's kind of like nice because it includes a bit of participation on God's part as well. Like it could be the case that like you might think that God wants to maximize the amount of participation that takes place in the world, so he just lets creatures do everything that they could to bring about the ideal state of the world. And he could like create them with certain faculties, maybe that they would eventually attain that. But then there would be a certain aspect of participation missing, maybe of God's role in that actual participate, that like whether or not God's participating in that final step. Because, yeah, God could be the participant in the first step, but if in order for him to participate even more at the final step, he would have to have something to do. And so, yeah, I sort of circled back around and sort of messed the main point I had. But yeah, just the idea that God's supernatural intervention would be necessary, but it would only be done after the creatures had already done the most that they could. So the idea is that God takes a sort of minimal role with regards to what sort of things are being done in the world, so that the creatures within that world can play a maximal role in what they're actually contributing towards. So there's a generosity on God's part to not take credit for everything that happens in the world because he's the best at it, but actually let creatures to participate in their minor way to these really good things. so that they could actually have some credit to play in the being of those good things. Yeah.
That's cool. I mean, we're going to be staying on this a little bit for a little while now. So,
Mm-hmm.
if you've forgotten something, I'm sure you can bring it back into answers to the next few questions. I guess
Okay.
if your theodicy is correct, it's logically possible for creatures within a non-ideal world to create more extreme levels of good and evil for other conscious creatures. So, say we kind of over the next 20,000 years, humans remain on the scene. We create better and better technology. We can actually simulate worlds that are kind of have conscious life potentially. Like I don't know how these boundaries could lie, but basically we can create conscious life, whether it be simulated or unsimulated, and we have better or worse ways to begin to bring about good or evil. So I can point to something like factory farming as a factual thing that we are doing right now, which is creating tons and tons of evil, consciously tormenting creatures day in and day out across the globe in a massive scale. You can imagine us being able to begin to create simulated conscious creatures and kind of recreating the world over and over and over again and putting different plagues and things in there to see how we'd respond and how we'd adapt and stuff, and basically creating evil beyond end. Like, what are the if you've got a child, so I've got two, you have limits where you will say, I'll let you do this and to this point, and then you'll learn a lesson. But if you keep going, I'm going to stop you from hurting yourself because you're going to go
Mm-hmm.
too far and you're going to do irreparable damage to you or someone else or whatever. And you rein them in at those points. And I think children work really well in those sort of kind of boundaries as well. And I kind of guess the way that we view God very often is almost a parent over a child. It's, the Bible uses that analogy time and time again, or a mother hen over her chicks, or those sorts of things. And I guess my question is kind of, what are the limits? Like, when would God act in your eyes? Like, I could imagine us going to worse and worse evils. Like, we just don't morally care enough to actually get off our butts and change factory farming, or we decide that simulated consciousness isn't something that's morally applicable, so therefore it's okay. Like, what are the limits, do you think, that God would say enough's enough and actually step in and help us to stop, or would he not? I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And uh, yeah, I don't know how good of a response that I have to this, but I find it at least somewhat interesting in that if we look back at history, the development of technology basically has to coincide with the development of the expansion of the moral circle. Or it's not that it has to, but it at least did sort of coordinate in that fashion to where, like, if you were to imagine that you gave thermonuclear warheads to Genghis Khan or something like that, and his sort of plans. We're kind of lucky in that regard that, like, yeah, Genghis Khan, he had a significant role and, like, devastated all of Asia, and so and he was a significant warlord. But imagine how much worse it would be if, like, he had thermonuclear weapons as well, such that, like, yeah, he could run things quite horribly, even worse. And so there's a sort of, like, interesting coincidence, a coincidence to where, like, the development of technology and the higher capabilities that the human race has had has been accompanied by a general moral development as well. As it is, I'm actually of the opinion that we're probably excelling to a higher degree technologically speaking than we are keeping pace morally speaking. So that's a concern, especially for this theodicy, and also just with regards to existential risk as well. But I do think that, yeah, maybe there's some fact of the matter that is, I don't know, some sort of fine tuning maybe on Guy's part, that through the developments of technology that gives less reason for people to behave immorally towards one another. And so that would, like, if it were the case that there was this post scarcity society that was able to, like, develop simulated societies underneath it, that they wouldn't really have much more motivation to create these sorts of peoples. That's something that we can maybe hope for in order to avoid the simulation problem posed by Nick Bostrom. And then the other consideration is to do with, like, factory farming. It's just, it literally is the case that we have a great amount of power at being the human race, and we're using a lot of that power for the detriment of creatures besides ourselves, that like chickens and cows and pigs and things like that in factory farms. And so the question is like, what sort of limits would God impose upon us so that we wouldn't go too far? Or we can talk about like the responsibilities that a parent gives to their children. Like when your child is 3, you're not going to give them the responsibility of caring for their dog, because they're just not going to be capable enough to do that. But once they're 10, that they're more than capable to do that. So you're going to put that under their responsibility. And so the question is like, okay, what sorts of things are God going to, what sort of limits is God going to impose upon us so that we won't go too far? And I guess, I don't know, at least as a minimal condition, I'd imagine that God would prevent us from annihilating all life on Earth. I feel like that would be a sort of like limit that would make sense for God to impose. And so if it were the case that we had the power to annihilate all life on Earth, then that would be maybe evidence against this participation theodicy. I don't think we're at that point currently, but we definitely do have, like through thermonuclear warfare, the possibility for something incredibly bad. And it may be like we have the power to exterminate the entire human race. And then the other consideration is, well, maybe if we did have that power, it would have to come with an overwhelming moral prevention of that power. So like the idea is that, so God is all powerful, but we're not worried about God doing anything bad because God's of a perfect moral character. And so similarly, as we progress in our capacity to influence the world, that capacity would have to be sort of limited by our moral considerations or our moral character, or I guess it would have to be our overall moral character regarding us as a human race. So it is a sort of like interesting consideration of like, what sort of limits could we expect given this theodicy, and would it be would we expect for it to coincide with our moral characters being developed through time as well? And so maybe that could be a piece of evidence in favor of the theodicy, that like, oh, well, we happen to observe in our past history that all of our technological developments have come with some sort of moral developments as well, to where our moral considerations have been expanded beyond just ourselves, but also to others, more so, where we started as a very insulated national, we started from a very insulated state of a moral circle where I only care about me, and then that expanded to like, I only care about me and my offspring, and then it came to, okay, I only care about me, my offspring, and my close relatives, and then further and further and further to where we're now morally considering creatures that we bear no real direct connection to, and we're even considering the sentience of non-biological life. Like there's such thing as AI ethics that people are taking into consideration. So the moral circle is expanding ever greater. To come to quote from Peter Singer. That's not a quote. Just the term that he uses. The moral circle expansion.
No, that's interesting. I mean, you mentioned Nick Bostrom, I think, and he's got a really interesting paper called the Vulnerable World Hypothesis, and he kind of in there he talks about this idea of kind of urns, an urn, and kind of every discovery that we make, we're pulling a ball out of the urn, and some of these balls are white and they have kind of no negative consequences due to them. Some balls are grey where there's good and bad with those, and then some balls could potentially be black, which would be almost signify the end of civilization. And his question is is something like thermonuclear warheads, nuclear bombs, etc., is that a black ball that is yet to be actualized? Like, is that just something that's waiting to happen? And something else you could think about is the fact that we can right now print basically DNA code, and the kind of DNA sequence for smallpox is available online for anybody to go and download. So theoretically, if you are a terrorist with resources, you could go and print yourself some smallpox and distribute that very easily through airports, etc. So we're in a very, I think, precarious position at the moment where, as participants in this world, we're able to do these things. Now, we don't do them, but is that because the cost of technology currently to print DNA is so high? I think so, but that cost is going to come down as costs do for everything eventually. So I guess the sort of question around this is, do you think it could be possible for God to be gambling? Like, could God potentially be creating the worst possible world where, and this is how I would define it, not that it's consistently evil, but that actually we move towards goodness, but we fall off the cliff. Like, we don't actually get there, although we try our best. And for some reason, say smallpox is what wipes out the world. I know a lot of people are vaccinated against this, etc. But say that something like smallpox is printable and is spread across the world, that all life just dies. Like, that's a possibility, right? So I guess, is God gambling with this?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I want to go back to the simulation thing from Nick Bostrom as well. But yeah. So would it be possible for our technological developments to actually lead to the annihilation of the human race and maybe even all life on Earth as well? And whether or not that would like make all of the participation that had taken place so far valueless, I guess. And I'd say no. Like, even if it were the case that all life on Earth were to be annihilated through thermonuclear warfare, or maybe like some sort of smallpox vaccine that basically goes wrong and kills off all life on Earth, that would be really rough. That would be pretty bad. But all of the individuals that God could, so all of the individuals that had ever come into existence, God could provide them with a happy afterlife. And the fact that they exist and live in that world would be due to the causal contributions of creatures other than themselves. And so there would be this sort of contribution to the precise number and character of the individuals in an eternal afterlife. And it would be because of the creatures participating in bringing about that good end. So this is somewhat related, but I was in a debate probably, I don't know, maybe 4 years back or so. I'm not sure exactly. And I was pretty sympathetic towards Nick Bostrom's simulation hypothesis. And I found it fairly intuitive and made a lot of sense. And there's this consideration of like, okay, well, why would a post-scarcity society create creatures in simulations? And I have a sort of like theodicy for why they might have some sort of motivation to do that, is because that individuals in a post-scarcity society will have a lot of resources available to them that could make that world extremely vulnerable, like the ability to bioprint DNA that could annihilate all life on Earth, or like be able to 3D print a gun or something like that, or be able to like look up on the dark web how to build a bomb and then do stuff like that. And so there would be a vulnerability to such a society, such that the individuals within that society would be prudent to test the moral character of the individuals that are going to inhabit that society through a series of, I guess, lives, basically, in some sort of simulated realm. And so that would make sense as to why would, there be this sort of like testing ground for individuals to live in a simulated world to see whether or not they'd be worthy of living in such a vulnerable society with all this technological development, where you can just go to a transporter, or not a transporter, what is the machine in Star Trek where they just create anything that you ask of it, and then it'd be able to make it made. If you had bad intentions and you were to use that technology, then that would be a really detrimental, that would be a major flaw to that society. So there would be like some reason why these sorts of creatures in a world, post scarcity world, would produce a lot of sort of simulated realities that is testing the moral character of individuals. And like, I don't know, maybe if we arrive at that sort of technologically developed state, that would be something that we would have to take into consideration. It's like, look, we don't know what sort of moral characters we're going to get from people just through mere reproduction. So we should maybe allow them to undergo that reproduction, but put the individuals that have been reproduced in a sort of, I guess, matrix-like scenario where they're tested, their moral character is tested to see whether or not they would be worthy of living in this sort of world. Because otherwise, they could, if they had a bad will, then they could really screw things up for us. And of course, that leads into the Nick Bostrom simulation hypothesis dilemma, or it's not a dilemma, but like a sort of trichotomy of like there's three different possibilities here. And if you think that a post-scarcity society would have motivation to create a lot of simulated worlds, then you should think that you're probably in one of those simulated worlds rather than one of the real worlds. And like, I don't know, I have to assign some non-zero possibility to that outcome. And so like, yeah, maybe it is that I'm living in a simulation right now. I'd be a little bit upset, but I mean, I could understand the motivations behind it if I was in a simulation from some sort of post-scarcity society, humans or aliens or something like that.
I find it really interesting, the idea of a simulation. I thought about it a lot, and my thought is, I guess, if God, so if atheism's correct, or non-theism, whatever term you want to use, is correct, and there's just the natural, then that's all there is, and it's like the simulation thing doesn't make sense. But even on the idea of a God, you could argue that we're just like even the natural is just a simulation. Like you can imagine simulations being so complete that the natural feels like it's natural, even if it's just, you know, numbers floating behind the scenes like in the Matrix. Like it just feels like it's the natural world, but actually it's just not. So I guess even on the sort of God hypothesis, you can almost kind of say that you're in a simulation. This isn't it. This is a beginning to get to, as through participation, to get to it, whatever it is. I don't know. Maybe I'm stretching that a little bit too far. I think
no. Yeah. I think that's a good point. Yeah.
Go on, if you want to push into it, feel free, John. But I've got a few more questions after that.
Yeah, no, go ahead. Yeah, I was a little bit like, should I bring up the simulation hypothesis? Isn't really related, but I mean, it somewhat is. I know I find it interesting.
Yeah, Nick Bostrom is such an interesting character. I'll throw a link to his website with a lot of his papers in for the listener viewers, so check those out. It's well worth your time. I guess I kind of want to ask the question about this theodicy itself then. Has it set itself up as being non-refutable? Like, what would... Like, I guess if you could talk about the sort of external world skeptic, there isn't anything you could say to refute them. That it's just that is the position they're taking, and anything you present isn't possible to prove that that's not true. Therefore, they're just in that place. Like, does this theodicy, like, what would be required for this theodicy to be incorrect? Like, even if the whole world ended, would it still work? Like, you know, it feels like you can add in things like an afterlife, this creator, like these things that kind of get added into it, which are almost like the get out of jail card in Monopoly. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, that's a good question, especially since a lot of theodicies would like basically give the theodicist so much grounds to sort of explain away all evils that it seems like basically any world that has any sort of evils could be explained away by this sort of theodicy. And that raises the question: is like, okay, is this just a non-falsifiable hypothesis that you're presenting here? And I think that, yeah, that can be definitely a concern, and especially in trying to present a case that's supposed to be plausible to an ideal agnostic, then you want to present a case that isn't going to throw up those sorts of red flags. And I do think that my participation theodicy is falsifiable in a sense, because like I can imagine worlds in which you would have strong evidence against the participation theodicy being the case, because like if we were to exist in a world in which like people's opportunities for contributing towards the eventual idealization of the world are everly are ever decreasing. Like, were it the case that you start off with having a great amount of opportunities to contribute towards an ideal good, and then those opportunities are slowly decreasing, and then over time you're observing as well, like, oh, we're getting further and further away from the eventual idealization of the world to where we're going to be stuck at a sort of stagnant position, in which case nothing can be improved anymore, and it's not in its ideal state yet. That would be significant evidence against this the participation theodicy, I think. Yeah, so any sort of world in which you're noticing a ever decreasing trajectory of axiological value, that things are getting worse and worse over time, and there's no things that are getting better and better in conjunction with that. That would be strong evidence against this view, I think, because because it's obviously not leading towards an eventual participation. The creatures in that world aren't actually contributing towards participation, aren't participating in the eventual idealization of the world. They're actively making it worse. And so, I think there are points of evidence that's going to be in contrast to that, which we could observe theoretically. It's not like outside of the realm of possibility. But I happen to think that when we do look at the world, we can sort of observe an upwards trajectory of axiological or of value, because we started off this world in a pretty dead state. Our universe, insofar as we understand it to be the beginning of our history, was without any agents or creatures or anything that are intrinsically good. And only later was it the case that there were these things that had some sort of inherent value to themselves. I don't know how much value we want to say that flagellum and like bacteria have in themselves. Maybe nothing, but they're at least closer to something of value. And I think maybe once we develop into multicellular organisms, and then from there, like more complex creatures that have their speciations that can have like young that they're reared by themselves, by one another, and things like that. That's going to be more goods that are being attained, and then that's going so far in looking backwards at the trajectory of the types of things that are occurring in the world. We're attaining more and more types of good things that are higher and higher goods, to the point that we're now at our state where we're able to communicate across the globe and like discuss the highest sorts of things. That's one example. There's a lot better things that are also we have access to in our current day and age. And if we're to look to history and notice sort of this upward trajectory of value, then we should similarly think that, well, I'd expect in the future that upward trajectory shall continue. And so this is in line with what we would expect given a sort of participatory motivation by God.
It's really interesting. So I want to dive into then kind of. So let me phrase this with a bit of Dostoevsky. So I'm a big Dostoevsky fan. I love his works. There's a book called Notes from Underground, which kind of talks about this protagonist in a variety of ways. But one of the things that's raised in the novel is this idea of this sort of idealized state. So Dostoevsky actually came over to the UK. He went to see Crystal Palace, this massive kind of crystal kind of dome structure at the time in the 1800s. There's a football team called Crystal Palace now as well, but back then there was sort of this big museum display which was called the Crystal Palace, which he went to inspect. And from that he got this idea of this sort of kind of idealized state that humanity is trying to get to. And in the book, he talks about the protagonist walking down the street and making rude hand gestures within the garments that he's wearing against the idealized state. Even though on the outside, he's still acting like he's participating in the world, in the environment, in the social class and structure. He's doing these things to deliberately show that he is able to have the freedom of will to push against that which has been put on him as this is what the top moral truth is. This is what it's like to live in the full reality. So I guess the kind of question boils down to, that's the end of the Dostoevsky thing. So the question boils down to, like, is it really logically possible to have a fully idealized world and the ability to contribute towards ideal goods? So we're talking here about things like free will, like the ability to do otherwise. Like if you're in a fully ideal world, are you actually going to be able to do anything other than contribute towards these ideal goods? It feels like potentially not. I don't know.
No, that's a really good question. And I think it will fall in line with like our view of sanctification and soteriology, like the idea of the attaining a perfect state of character, as well as like the eventual resting place of your will and your soul. And like I'm not trying to like build in soul theodicies or soul metaphysics into this view, but just at least the idea that that the sort of character that we develop through our actions will potentially be fixed at some point. But I don't think that it requires that it negates your free will. It just negates your free will in certain respects. So when you were a child, you would like have desires for things that were bad. Like you wanted to have candy all the time. And now as you've grown up as an adult, you probably don't have those sorts of desires anymore. And so you've developed and matured. And so there's certain things that are no longer on the table for you with regards to like what you could use your will towards bringing about. But that doesn't mean that you've like no longer have free will. Like I think that God is free will in that he has a variety of goods available in front of him, and then he can choose amongst those goods. And I think that the angels and the saints in heaven, having attained a sanctified state, also have free will in that they have a variety of goods that they can choose amongst and bring about. Yeah, but then I guess there's a question of that sort of like, yeah, the underground man from Dostoevsky's novel is like, there's this sort of like human agency that seems higher good, that being the ability to rebel even against what is being presented to you as this ideal good. Is like, no, I think the ability to stand up and like go against something, even though it's objectively good, is a sort of like core component to the human spirit. Like it's if we were to be made such that we could no longer voice our resentment even against things that are good, we would cease to be human. Maybe like that's kind of like I think it's from the Underground Man, where like this idea that, maybe from a different Dostoevsky novel, the idea that like if you were put into a world in which all there was for you was the pleasures of reproduction and sweet cakes to enjoy, then you could like rebel against that society and like destroy it and like put a, like really and that's an aspect of the human condition, that like we're not satisfied by mere pleasures. Rather, what we desire is struggle. And I think that's a core part of like Dostoevsky's personal theodicy, is the idea that, yeah, part of what it is to be human is to live in that struggle and the suffering and the pain and the muck and the mire and the horribleness. And that's what we enjoy. That's the kind of things that we are, is that we're only happy when we've been given these struggles to overcome. And that's what makes us feel alive, such that if we were to be put into a place that is just for our own pleasures, we would hate it. We would actively try to destroy it. And that's just the sort of psychological condition of humanity. And I think you could run a sort of theodicy off of that. But I don't think it's a very good theodicy, because our psychological conditions, at least supposedly, would be the product of God. If God were to create us in such a way that we are not happy by pleasures, rather we're only happy by overcoming struggle and pain and suffering, that's going to be a consequence of God's deciding to imbue us with that sort of psychological state or that psychological condition. Now, I think that theodicy can be made more sense of when paired with a sort of participation theodicy, because it's not the case that your psychological state is purely the product of God's divine will. Rather, your psychological state and what you enjoy and what you dislike is going to be partially the product of creaturely contribution, such that, like, yeah, the actions and behaviors of your genetic predecessors and even those fellow members of your society are contributing towards what you desire, what you enjoy, and what you avoid, and things like that. And so your personal psychology might not be perfectly in line with what would be the objective good, but yeah, it's part of the imperfect process that's leading up to an eventually ideal state. And I think that, yeah, through sanctification, people who die, even in a state of like having imperfect desires, God will be able to work with them and provide them with a more unified and holistic set of desires, such that they now seek out the good in its entirety and would be content even in an ideal state of the world. I think it's more of an indication of our fallen human condition that we would be unhappy to be merely pushed into an ideal world, and we would find it distasteful. But it would require a sort of like working to overcome our personal psychologies so that we can appreciate it for that fact. And yeah, I mean, there is still the question of like, well, would an ideal world with just the pleasures of reproduction alongside eating sweet cakes to enjoy, would that be the sort of ideal world that I have in mind? Is like, well, no, not really. I think that there's a lot of goods that can come about through struggle that could even be had within an ideal world. Like there's struggles of trying to work through a hard math problem, or the struggles of like trying to make sense of something in philosophy that I particularly enjoy, or the struggles of like enduring a sport, things like that. And I think all of these are going to be the sorts of struggles that could and would be had within an ideal state of the world that wouldn't require um, the sorts of things that are intrinsically unpleasant or bad, like pain and suffering.
There's so much here. There's so much here. I'm aware I want to dive into these three examples shortly. Um, I guess I kind of want to, I feel like you've answered this already, but I kind of want to ask the question, like, is it right for gods to use non-consensual suffering as a form of sacrifice to kind of slowly obtain greater goods? I feel like I have not, and this is personal, like I have not agreed to be partaking in this, if it's 20, 80%, whatever the percentage is, if God's real, if it's all true,
Mm-hmm.
to begin to add towards this greater good. Now, I'm aware that some people kind of say, it's almost like we're, I don't know, parachuters, that we're in the plane and God is speaking to us, and God said to us, do you want to partake? And we say yes, and we jump out the plane, we're crossing our arms, we're falling down the sky, we're falling, the parachute opens, we land on Earth, and our memories have been wiped, and we're now just babies partaking in this sort of world, and we're trying to like make the best of it. And we did consent once, but we just can't remember now. Or and I guess we sort of added in divine intervention. We've added in the idea of sort of the afterlife. We added in sort of kind of soteriology, or kind of recompense for evils. And I think we kind of need to add in kind of consent, which we've touched on a little bit. I just feel that it's using the fawn analogy that we said before, that God would enable a fawn to die in a forest if the fawn knew that some of the actions it performed was going to be leading slowly towards these greater goods. The fawn needs to have the ability to experience the greater goods eventually. Otherwise, the fawn's suffering, even though it would have consented, isn't actually granting it anything at all. I don't know what you think about that, but I guess the question kind of comes down to, is it right for gods to place these beings into this world if they might have once consented but can no longer remember? It feels like you could think of any suffering scenario, I won't list them for people, where it's just a little bit too much. I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. So yeah, I want to lay out that there are certain pre-existence consent-based theodicies that are out there. There's my friend Amos Woolen, who I'll actually be debating next week on the topic of Hinduism versus Christianity. He has a blog post where he sort of lays out this sort of theodicy that he, I think it's in a blog post. I don't know, maybe he's written somewhere about it. That the idea that in order for God to act rightly to all the individuals that are going to suffer, he must first, or you could even make a weaker stance. You're not saying that he must do this, but that it would be the best thing for him to do is to first get consent from them beforehand so that they could go through this. And so he's sympathetic towards a Hinduistic sort of picture of reality, which does include that sort of consent first based approach to be prior to incarnation. I know within Mormonism, that's an explicit teaching of the church as well, that you, prior to your existence, have like signed the contract saying that I accept all the possible sufferings and pains that I'm going to endure in this life, and I do so willingly of my own desire. But there's still the question there of like, how much are you the same person, given that you lack that memory and maybe are actively now retroactively taking back that consent. Like, I do not consent to undergo this horrible suffering and pain that I'm currently undergoing. And so if you were to respect my consent prior to my actually experiencing the event, you should similarly respect my consent afterwards and not wanting to undergo that experience anymore. And what I was bringing up earlier with regards to consent wasn't to do with like an actual consent that God was receiving from us prior to our incarnation. I was talking of a purely hypothetical consent, that God could recognize that were this creature to have the rational faculties and be able to understand the entire motivation set that I have here, they would consent to being brought into existence. And so that's sufficient in my mind to to act for the to act with regards to an individual's outcomes. And I think a similar sort of concern can be raised in natalist ethics, where if consent is always required before you impose any sort of harm or suffering upon an individual, then that's going to face a problem for any sort of like reproduction, because you literally can't achieve consent, or you can't get the consent of your future child when you bring them into existence. Rather, you have to hope that they would consent were they capable, but you can't know beforehand whether they actually would. And so if there is this sort of like strong view of consent that it is absolutely required before imposing any individual to the possibility of harm, then that's just going to strictly entail antinatalism, that the idea that it's always morally impermissible to reproduce. Unless something changed to where like God could sort of like reveal to us, hey, the soul up in heaven is given it the A-OK, so go for it. But that's not the case. So we can't really have that. So yeah, I think that in order to avoid this sort of antinatalist outlook, we would have to lower our ethical principles to say that a purely hypothetical consent is sufficient. And I think that given the reasons I've laid out, a creature would have reason to hypothetically consent to being a pawn, I guess, or an instrument to God's eventual creation of the ideal world, because that is just the highest good that a creature could contribute towards. Like, of all the things that a creature could do, the highest thing that it could do would be to contribute towards the eventual idealization of the world. There's nothing better that a creature could do than that. There's nothing better that God could do than that. And so if we think that it would be good for God to create an ideal world, then we should similarly think that it would be good for a creature to contribute towards bringing about that ideal world. And so, given the fact that we take into consideration what the highest good would be for a creature when we're making decisions on their behalf, we should rightly think that they would consent to being part of the process that it leads to the eventual idealization of the world. And there's one other thing. A concern I have for this sort of pre-existence theodicy that somebody like Josh Rasmussen, which you're familiar with, he endorses, or at least he's very sympathetic towards, is it seems to cheapen the suffering that we undergo in our life, because there are genuine sacrifices that are being made in accordance with our circumstances, that if we had known about these sacrifices beforehand and consented to it prior, it would make the sacrifice less meaningful. So like there's examples of women who maybe have certain vulnerabilities such that if they were to go through childbirth, it could very likely kill them. And they're faced with the decision, okay, do I continue to rear this child within me and with the expectation that I very likely will die once this child comes to term, or do I abort the child? And like that's a significant moral dilemma that somebody can face, and like there's opinions that could be had on either side. But I think that there's a sort of like genuine nobility to be had for someone that does recognize the sacrifice that they would have to make and willfully endorses it and has to face it. Now, imagine that same individual that does like goes through childbirth and it kills them, that prior to being incarnate, they were given the full awareness of what their life would encompass. And then they were like, yeah, I want to choose that sort of type of sacrifice to live out. It seems like the fact that it was pre-chosen beforehand, like really diminishes the type of sacrifice that was being made by that individual. It seems like they didn't need to make the sacrifice prior to their existence on Earth, but it's only once they were in this position that they were given the opportunity to, maybe live out the sacrifice or not. And that seems more genuine to me. And so, like, I think that the motivations behind the consent, pre-existent consent theodicy I can get the motivations, but I think that they ultimately lead to a lesser view of the sort of suffering that we face in our life.
If you're watching this, then I just wanted to let you know that you can access the same content in audio-only form by subscribing via Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Audible. In fact, you can search for the Socratic Sessions in your favourite podcast app, and whilst you're there, please leave a 5-star review. It helps others to discover these conversations. All links are in the description, and thank you. So I guess quite a quick fire question then. So the fawn that gets trapped in a forest and burns to death, although wasn't explicitly asked and consented to its life, is still giving value and has consented in God's eyes. How is that fawn rewarded or compensated for its actions then? What does that look like, John?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say that the fawn actually did consent in God's eyes, but God sort of is acting on behalf of the fawn to recognize that they would consent had they been given fully informed of the situation. Because it is kind of like incoherent to say that somebody can consent to coming to exist, because you would have to first exist in order to consent. And so there's that sort of problem. And even with regards to the pre-existence theodicy, you can't really consent to experience the pain of this life if you've never actually experienced the pain of this life. And so you're not really making an informed decision, you're making an uninformed decision. So it seems like there's still a sort of problem there. But yeah. Okay, so what sort of compensation would be had for the fawn? I'm glad that we did this like this late into the conversation, because I see that a lot of people responding to the problem of animal suffering by talking about some sort of animal afterlife, as if that is what sort of justifies the suffering that an animal will go through. And I don't think that is what would justify it. Like, just because I have this really good thing for you, I'm going to first put you through a really traumatic and horrible thing beforehand, and then you'll get that good thing. And that good thing is so much better than the trauma that you experienced before that. Therefore, it's like made right. It's like, no. If you're God, you can just like avoid the trauma and the suffering beforehand and just give them that good thing. You don't need to have them go through the horrors of like burning to death in a forest fire. And so the idea is that the fawn is compensated for its life, the suffering that it's faced in its life, but it's not. It's the reason that the fawn is suffering is not for the compensation. It's for its contribution or its part to play in the total process of the eventual idealization of the world. That's what sort of justifies their existence in this circumstance, even though it does lead to genuinely gratuitous evils that can occur and that occur for them. And so the question is like, what sort of compensation afterwards for this fawn would be had? And some people like Trent Doherty, he'd want to say that the afterlife of animals is like their nature is changed such that they become rational, that they're able to cognize the role that they played, and they're able to see things from a rational perspective, and they're able to attain the beatific vision as well. That is a view, and I'm not like arguing against that view. I don't think it's necessary as a position. I think you could think that maybe the nature of a fawn or an animal is such that its highest goods are non-rational, and so to change them such that they now enjoy a sort of rational union with God is just going to make them into a different type of thing. And so if you're compensating the type of thing that suffered, then you should compensate them given the type of thing that they are. So a fawn that dies in a forest fire, its compensation should be the sort of thing that a fawn would enjoy, the sort of lifestyle that a fawn would enjoy to have. So I'd imagine that its afterlife would be very bodily. It's going to be a sort of like bodily afterlife where God like basically reincarnates this animal, gives them a maybe glorified state where they're not going to be faced with the dangers of predators and things like that. But they're able to live out a life of happiness with the other fawns and the other deer and the other wildlife that are there in the world. And yeah, this would definitely require a significant amount of like supernatural activity on God's part, but the individual itself was the very reason that it exists in this afterlife was due to the participation that led up to them through all the creatures beforehand. And the state in which they're currently existing within was the eventual causal effect of all that creaturely contribution that took place prior to that. Yeah.
Very interesting. Very interesting. I wonder what a shark would get. Like, its thing is kind of killing other creatures and eating them and swimming consistently. Like, it would just be like all the food, but it'd be non-conscious food. It would just be like food ready. Anyway, it's interesting.
Yeah. Like these robotic fish out there that the shark enjoys capturing and like tasting and going after. That could be something specific to the shark.
Yeah.
It's hard to like understand what would be the ideal world for a mosquito though, because like, okay, are they're just these blood bags that are going out, or do like, I don't know, human beings like willfully give up their body for the mosquitoes? Like, yeah, I'll let this mosquito drink from my blood, and then it's like that satisfies it, and like the human is willing to sort of like be that almost is willing to be the victim of the mosquito for its own good. I don't know.
But you could almost imagine a single, like we have now, or how people think we have now, a single unified conscious world where creatures are conscious on different levels, and afterlife being a plethora of simulated via God worlds where various conscious creatures of different ilk are put to enjoy life with other potentially non-conscious creatures. If they are predators, they are dinosaurs, like a Tyrannosaurus Rex, they could begin to feast upon the flesh of non-conscious creatures, and it wouldn't cause them pain or suffering because consciousness wasn't a thing. They just were. Potentially. I don't know.
Interesting.
I don't know.
Yeah. No, like, the wolf pack, they get to enjoy the spoils of like hunting deer, but all of the deer there are zombie deer, where they don't actually experience the world. They're just simulated realities that the wolves can enjoy hunting down. There's also, I don't know if this is from C.S. Lewis or from somebody else, but the idea that there would be this sort of like active play between the deer and the wolf, that the wolf pack could chase the deer. And it's almost like a game, because the deer knows that if I get attacked by the wolf, they're just playing. Basically, they're going to tear me apart, but my body will restore and I'll be able to keep living on. So I'm not going to be afraid of anything. Similar to how, like, you'll have kittens playing with each other, and they're not really afraid of like what's going on, even though they'll pretend like I'm going to tear you down. And so you'll also have a lot of play, and it may be from like our perspective that's a really gruesome way to play, but like, I mean, it's an ideal state of the world in which God is sort of like restoring our bodily flesh, so it's never going to, like, by tearing out my heart, you're not going to kill me. It's going to sort of regrow. Then I mean, there wouldn't be any sort of moral or ethical concerns with a wolf pack that's like tearing a deer apart, because that deer is kind of consenting to it and is like playing with these wolves. And that is a sort of like weird view, but I just like prefer the views where like all of the animals can like cohabitate with one another, rather than this idea of like in separate universes or like simulated worlds. But I think that world is also very coherent and very plausible as well. So I'm taking no stance between the two.
Okay, so we're going to move on to 3 examples and the counter argument now. We'll try and smash this in the next 20 minutes to hit the 3-hour-ish mark.
Okay.
The sort of idea of these 3 examples is probably to go over ground that we've covered, but to really dive into it, and just to kind of not dive into it, but to specifically hit each point, I think, in a way that makes sense. So let me just share my screen again. So this is example number 1. And then there's basically for each of these, I'm going to read out what's on the screen, and there's a sort of picture if people want to see that as well. And then there's a question that kind of goes into it, just to dive a little bit deeper. So the background for this one is quite a quick one. So exploring the starting point for non-ideal worlds with sentient creatures. So I call this the sort of horror scale. So 1 being the sort of worst imaginable horror, and 10 being the absence of horror. So that'd be the sort of beatific vision. So the question really is, if God started at a 3 for us, say, and we're going to reach a 10, why didn't he start at an 8? And I guess, is he morally blameworthy for not starting at an 8?
Yeah. No, that's a really good question. So the idea behind the participation theodicy is that if it would be good for God to create an ideal world, and it would be better for creatures to participate in the protection of that ideal world, then God would have reason to allow these creatures to participate in doing so, and that gives him reason to create an initially non-ideal world, state of the world. And so it can be asked, like, okay, what sort of non-ideal state of the world would God be inclined to create? He could create a 9.9, such that there is still going to be participation that leads to the eventual idealization of the world, but it's going to be a very minimal amount of participation on the part of creatures. So if we think that it would be good for creatures to exist in a state of 9.9, then we could similarly ask, well, like, would it be good for God to create them in that state? Well, yes. And would it be good for creatures to participate in the bringing about of that 9.9 state? Then it seems like, well, yeah, given our similar reasoning from above, we should think that it's also going to be good for creatures to contribute towards the 9.9 state. And so that gives us reason to expect a 9.8 state. And we can keep going back and back and back and back and back. And then there's going to be the question of like, okay, what is the far limit of this sort of like line of reasoning? Is it going to be the case that we would expect, if God wants us creatures to participate in the idealization of the world, that he would create us in an initially horrible hellscape in which like we're all suffering awful torment at a 1 or maybe a 0.0000001 where it's like awful, but there is like small mitigations of suffering that can be had in that world. So there is a little like tiny little upward trajectory of axiological good that's taking place in that world. And it is eventually going to arrive at that ideal state of the world. And so, yeah, it seems like if we sort of run this line of argumentation, we're going to arrive at this is the sort of world that God would create. But we look out in the world and we recognize, hey, we didn't start off in a pretty much a hellscape. We started off in a pretty neutral vantage point, and then that led to there being good and bad things that took place. So this is going to be evidence against the theodicy. And so I don't want to sort of like push back. It's not the case that any prior state of affairs is going to be also intrinsically good, and God would have reason to bring it about. I think that God's reasons for bringing about a non-ideal world is going to be the sorts of, it's not going to be the case that it's just because it could be the causal predecessor to a better state of affairs. Rather, we want to talk about the world having its own intrinsically good state of affairs within it. And so I think from my theodicy, it's not the case that we would expect the worst possible world to be the causal predecessor to the eventual idealization of the world. Rather, we would expect an intrinsically neutral state of a world, I guess. Or I don't know why I added intrinsically there, but a neutral state of the world, such that there's a possibility that creatures can contribute towards the eventual idealization of the world. Because if you were to choose anything less than neutral to start things off from, it would seem like you're actually detrimenting the creatures by putting them into that state. I think, yeah, that's how I at least think about this theodicy, in that the starting ground we should expect to be a sort of neutral state. I'd imagine that if we were to sort of like use your scale there, a neutral state should probably be a 5, where there's a sort of absence of horror and there's also an absence of beatitude. And so there's just like neutral things that are like things that exist of no positive nor negative value. And lo and behold, as it turns out, when we look at the causal history of our world, we happen to have started off, insofar as we know, in a generally neutral state of affairs. Like atoms and quarks and leptons and electrons don't have any sort of positive or negative value to them. But yet they, when they are formed in a particular way, can lead to things that do have positive value and negative value. And so that's why God would create a world like ours to start things off.
Nice. Okay, let's push on to example number 2. So this one is what I call Mars 2. try and get most of it on the screen for people. So this one, I'm hopeful to look at kind of the idea of moral evils, and I'd call it the sort of great reset. So there's two questions of this one, so I'll kind of read the spiel. So again, example, there is only one known world in the universe with sentient life, and it is Mars 2. In Universe 2, Universe 2 is identical to ours in every way except life is on Mars. So the background for this one, I really went to like geek town with this, so apologies. 1.8 billion years ago, Mars 2 was a thriving world and was moving towards 7.2 on the horror scale, having started at 2.4, 4.1 billion years ago. Sentient creatures were slowly brought into existence on Mars Point 2 in Universe 2 by God to contribute to creating an ideal world from a non-ideal world. 100 years before the bombs fell, 90% of sentient creatures contributed towards building the ideal world, whereas 10% didn't. Moral agents destroyed this planet by detonating bombs above Mars 2, stripping Mars 2 of its atmosphere and rendering all life void. Now that Mars 2 has been destroyed, there is no known life in Universe 2, and thus the billions of years of conscious suffering of sentient creatures haven't continued to move the horror scale forward, but ultimately made it redundant. No conscious creatures equals no sentient horror-filled suffering. And then there's just a picture of our actual Mars, and I've claimed it's Mars today in Mars Universe 2. So I'm aware we've kind of touched on this, John, but I guess there's sort of two questions that I want to just push into a little bit more. So the first one really is, how can a benevolent and all-powerful God allow moral agents to destroy Mars 2, wiping out all sentient life and contradicting the supposed purpose of creating an ideal world?
No, that's a good question, because it leads to the question of like, okay, seems like you had all this sort of like causal contribution towards the eventual idealization of the world, and then that just gets negated by these actions of the 10% of the population of Mars 2. And that's seems like that's going to be in conflict with what we would expect from God creating a sort of participatory universe. And I guess I'd want to just say that like God is sort of hands off in that like he allows creatures to contribute towards the goods that are going to be had in the ideal world. But once it gets to that point where creatures are no longer capable of contributing towards the eventual goods of the ideal world, God will just sort of step in to complete the process, kind of like what we brought up before. And so if it were the case that on Mars 2, all of the Martians were annihilated through thermonuclear warfare or something like that, and that just exterminated all life in the entire cosmos, then God would still exist, and he would know how to sort of resurrect those creatures and or bring them into a beatified state with him in heaven. And those individuals would still be the product of causal contributions. And so there is still going to be an eventual ideal state of the world. It's just going to be a state of the world that doesn't include the annihilated Martian landscape, because that's been totally overwhelmed, such that for God to sort of recreate that landscape, it's no longer going to be the product of creaturely participation. It's just going to be God sort of like recreating of that thing. And maybe you could say that there is still an aspect of participation there, because so I might create this really intricate gift for you, and I might give it to you, and then say that gift burnt up in a fire. It seems like, oh well, my action was negated because the effect of my action is no longer there. But like if you were to sort of perfectly replicate the gift that I had given to you, then there would still be a sense in which like the fact of this new thing had all the elements to the prior thing. And it's only because I had made that prior thing that you recreated it in this new way by this other thing. And so there is still a sense in which even if God had to entirely replicate the universe back to the way it was beforehand, that it would be something that was the product of creaturely participation as well. I think that's how I would respond to that that thought experiment.
Interesting. I mean, so just I guess the second question then just dives a little bit more into it, and we have touched on these, but it's just to kind of bring it home as we bring things to a close. I guess I look at the universe, as already mentioned, and it seems, based on the current physics and the current understanding of how the universe has been moved and is moving, we're going to see the heat death appear eventually of everything. Like everything's going to burn out and stop functioning. Essentially, everything just becomes a single source of kind of thermonuclear equilibrium.
Mm-hmm.
I guess the question is, obviously there needs to be, and you've said before, this intervention at some point of a divine being. We've seen here in this idea of Mars 2, in Universe 2, of kind of this devoid life where there's nothing anymore, and say, in this one we're going to stipulate there is no other life at all whatsoever. I guess the question is kind of, if that is going to be the end goal, like if that is a possibility, does it ever need to have been an actual reality? Could it always have been the case where did there have to be participation and then nothing, or does there have to be a building to an ideal world? I guess there's this, that your theodicy seems to suggest this, we're going to move towards this sort of ideal state eventually. But if it is possible that there is a hard reset somewhere, or a break somewhere in it, it seems a little bit, okay, well, this doesn't quite feel right. I don't know. What are your thoughts around the potential of everything ending?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Some people think that if something is impermanent, then it's not going to be fully good, because there's some good that it could have had that it lacks, because it's going to eventually cease. I think that there can be made sense of a life that is well lived that does end in eventual death, in a sort of permanent sense of death. And I think that, yeah, we could talk about the eventual leading to an ideal world that persists for a while, for maybe a few billion years, and then it eventually ceases. And I think that would be in line with my participation theodicy, because what it means for there to be an ideal world is for there to be only features that are worth having and no features worth lacking. And it seems like if we talk about a thing that is really, really good, even though it ends at some point, that may be something that could be described as having only features that are worth having. It doesn't have the best features, of course, but it does have only good features. And we could still talk, like, yeah, there's some better world that could be had, but I'm not talking about making the best possible world. I'm talking about making an ideal world. That's why there are so many different types of ideal worlds that could be had. But theoretically, there's only one best possible world. And I think that, yeah, maybe the ideal world that we eventually, well, actually, no, I'm pretty sure we've already sort of like negated the best possible world, because a best possible world would be any opportunity for sin taking place would not have taken place. And that's a logical possibility, and I think a metaphysical possibility as well. But that didn't happen, so we're probably not in the best of all possible worlds, contra Leibniz. So yeah. One other thing I wanted to say is that some feature that a non-ideal world would have is probably going to be finitude. Like, it's not the case that a non-ideal world is going to last forever. And so maybe that's a reason to think that, given that our world is starting off in a non-ideal state, it's going to have laws of physics like entropy that will lead to its eventual heat death. And so God would give us a sort of limited time frame in which to contribute as much as we can to the eventual features of an ideal good, like forming experiences and characters and new individual persons and things like that, through. And then there's going to be a hard cutoff point to where, okay, you've done all that you can, given the sort of non-ideal world that you were brought into. Now I'm going to take all that you've contributed, and I'm going to transfer it over into this ideal world in which we can live out the rest of eternity in happiness with one another. Sort of new age, I guess, or the final, the end of the ages, that sort of thing. Yeah, and I think that makes a significant amount of sense. And if we were to think about, like, if God were to create a non-ideal world that was perpetual, that would be kind of worse, because then we would have to live out an infinite amount of time in this non-ideal state before finally arriving at that ideal state. But I don't know if you can undergo you cannot attain an infinite amount of events through successive addition. so long as that addition is done in a limited fashion. And like we're slowly progressing through time in a limited fashion. So yeah, I think if our world was infinite, such that it had no end to it, that would be maybe counter evidence against my theory, because then it would be like we're existing in a non-ideal world, and for all we know, it's going to persist in its non-ideal state of affairs. Rather, we should expect that if we're going to begin in a non-ideal world, I think we would imagine that it's going to be a finite world, because it's the suffering that's going to be essential to that world, or at least the possibility that for suffering that's essential to that world, shall not go on forever. God only puts us in a sort of finite amount of gratuitous suffering that we might have to face before eventually providing us with the circumstances of what would be an infinite amount of bliss with him in heaven.
So interesting. You said one thing there that I want to just touch on really briefly before we push on, which was that the best of all possible worlds would be one in which we did not allow sin to originally enter it. Something like that, those sorts of words. I guess my question is, like, do you really believe that? Because I think, so when I say do you really believe that, do you really believe we had a choice? Like, I really struggle to understand this idea that humanity has made a decision that we don't have a decision part in. We are suckered into some decision that somebody else made. I've used this analogy before of a string kind of leading back from the sort of beginning of creation, so the Big Bang, all the way through to us today. And at some point on that string, there has been an actual cut which has severed us from the source of creation, God, to ourselves today. And no matter where you go back on the actual string itself, it seems fundamentally impossible to pinpoint an actual time and place where somebody fully recognized God in all of his glory and turned around and went, no, I want nothing to do with that. That doesn't seem like an actual possibility. I don't think Adam and Eve are actual people. I think they're metaphors within Genesis. So I guess I kind of feel like I understand what you're saying. I don't think it's. Do you really think that the best of all possible worlds will be where sin doesn't exist? I think that's what we're literally saying, right, with the sort of beatific vision. But it's more a case of, I don't think we ever had a decision to not partake in that. I think that was never on the cards as far as I can tell.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Like, I think that some sort of like, maybe not an entailment, but an expectation from this sort of participation theodicy is to reject this sort of like fallen model of Genesis, to where like, oh, things had a sort of perfect state of affairs where Adam and Eve were living with God in the garden, and then things went bad. No, it's like the participation theodicy gives us reason to expect things start off with the potential for a significant amount of badness that can occur. And then as time progresses, things get continually closer and closer towards the idealization of the world. And so it's difficult to sort of square that idea with the classical view of like the Garden of Eden and things like that. Now, you could still do that if you were like definitely committed to there being a literal Adam and Eve and things like that. Like, I think there's ways in which to square that with the participation theodicy. It's just not going to be something that is a commitment of the participation theodicy. So for people that are atheists, that have no commitments to Adam and Eve being real people or anything like that, they're under no obligation or requirement in accepting the participation theodicy to believe in their existence. But the point I was making is that in a best of all possible worlds, whenever somebody was presented with the opportunity to perform an immoral action, they refrained from performing that action. So I think there's a lot of instances in our world where people are presented with the opportunity to either perform an immoral action or to perform a moral action. And I think it was up to them, in a metaphysical sense, whether or not they performed the immoral action. Like, so for example, say you find a wallet, and in that wallet there is $100, and you have a variety of options in front of you. You could turn that wallet into the police and have them sort of bring it to the person with the driver's license with the $100. You could remove the $100 and then turn it into the police, or you could just leave the wallet there with the money intact, or you could take the money and then leave the wallet there as well. And so, like, there's a variety of options for you. I think only one of those are probably going to be the moral option for you to choose. But I think that you, being a sort of maybe not you, but for a lot of people, there will be that sort of moral consideration that they have to go through. Like, should I take the money? Should I take the money and return the wallet? Should I take the money and leave the wallet? These sorts of things. And I want to say that these are like genuine options open and available to the individual, such that it is up to them whether or not they do the moral thing or if they refrain from doing that moral thing. And so I'd want to say that in a best of all possible world. So a possible world, I want to say it's genuinely possible that for any time somebody was given the moral decision of whether to do the right thing or the wrong thing, they did the right thing. And I want to say that's definitely a possibility. It's just not a possibility that was ever actualized. And so that's why I've reason to think that we don't live in the best of all possible worlds, because there are all of these possibilities that are genuinely out there that never came to fruition because of people's moral decisions. And this is this is nothing really to do with the theodicy. This is just more to do with my own conception of morality and free will. You could be a compatibilist and reject the idea that there are these genuine moral possibilities that one could actually have made to be the case, given that maybe determinism prevents that from being a genuine possibility, given the laws of physics and things like that. That is an option that somebody could hold to. I'm not a compatibilist, but I think that compatibilism isn't crazy. So yeah, that's something that somebody could hold to. But the other point that you were making too about how given this sort of starting this chain off on a sort of very slow crawl of evolution, it's going to be difficult to say that there ever was a time in which we were in a sort of morally perfect state, like Adam and Eve. It seems like there would always have been some point in time in which we had natural earthly desires that were in conflict with the good. And so it's a version of Adam and Eve where they have no concupiscence, which is the Catholic doctrine of desire towards sin. That's going to be hard to square with this sort of contiguous sort of stretch of line, connecting line between the very first organisms that came to exist and then our current existence now, because those organisms are very fallible and weak and limited, and they're going to be driven by evolution to desire things that aren't perfectly in line with the good. And so similarly, we would expect any proto-hominids and then eventual hominids to similarly have those sorts of desires that ingrained within them via evolution to desire things that are maybe good for the reproduction of the species, but not necessarily good for the individual's moral character. And so that there would be a sort of concupiscence even from our earliest rational ancestors. So maybe this expectation would fall in conflict with general Catholic teaching, or maybe general young earth creationist teaching and things like that. But as it is, an atheist or an agnostic is under no commitment to Catholicism or Christianity or young earth creationism or anything like that. So this is more to do with a theodicy for all theists of any stripe and stripe. Basically, they can appreciate the motivation and the reasoning behind the theodicy without having any sort of commitment to any religious claims, about what Adam and Eve must have been like or anything like that.
Very nice. Okay, example 3. Again, there's some background and a picture which I've just taken off the internet, so apologies whoever actually owns this picture. So I guess I'm calling it the sort of tree of not life analogy, like the natural evils. I think this, for me, this feels like where your theodicy has the most kind of work to do. So again, the background, over the last 3.7 billion years, life has been in a constant battle for survival. 5 major extinction events have resulted in the extinction of 99.9% of all species that have ever lived. Most of these species have died due to natural evils, which means that the tree of life has been branching down avenues for millions of years that have led to creation and destruction of pointless sentience. And I think the big thing here is these big extinction events, one of them being the sort of the comet, obviously, that kind of wiped out dinosaurs and all big life forms at that point, have meant that creatures have partaken, but actually their lines, their lineages, their purpose, their way of moving forwards has come to an abrupt end. And it's almost like they've partaked for literally no reason, because what they were propagating never propagated forwards. So that you've got 0.01% of all life that has moved to where we are today. So if you were to really wanting, or if you really wanted God to bring us to where we are today, there is a theoretical model in which only that lineage is in existence. And God could have obviously brought that about without these massive extinction events. I kind of almost view it as the sort of tree of life. If you were to imagine a tree on a hill and there's this beautiful massive tree, and then you were to turn a massive sun on behind it and you were to be able to see the shadow of the tree being cast before you, it's like there's a single tiny branch left and the rest of the tree is just in devastated ruins, just trunks all over the place and just branches just ripped apart from it. And it's like it's been smashed by storms. And there's this tiny branch, and it's almost like we're saying it's okay because this little branch is able to continue onwards, and we've now got Homo sapiens who are sentient enough to begin to participate in the story. And it kind of feels like, okay, but what about the rest of the tree? Surely there's something going on here. So the question was much more beautifully worded than that, John. But what about the rest of the tree?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, and I really like that visual analogy as well, because it is very apt, and it does apply to the significant portion of the animal species that have yet to exist, and even currently exist. Like, if you look at K-selective species, like I want to say that possums are kind of like this, where less than 50% of the baby possums born are going to die very soon out of the womb, because like possums have a very sort of reproductive strategy in which they will live very short lives, but they're going to reproduce as much as possible, and so there's going to be a lot of deaths that occur due to how much they're breeding. But all you really need is so that there's enough of them that will continue to breed again, and then that's what evolution is going to sort of axiomize. So yeah, there's all of these dead animals that are throughout the history of the world. And the concern for the participation theodicy is most of these animals, the participation that they played, if any, was cut to an end, such that it never eventually led to that ultimate fruition of the ideal world. Rather, their line of participation was stopped, and something else in its stead was now being the contributing factor towards the eventual idealization of the world. And yeah, that's a problem. But if we recognize that the type of world that these creatures are existing within is a non-ideal world, then that non-ideal world would give us reason to expect that not every creature within it is actually going to be capable of participating. In a ideal process towards the idealization of the world, every single individual within that world would be contributing a significant amount to the eventual idealization of that world. But given that God is creating the world in an imperfect starting form, that sort of ideal process is not going to be had. It has to be a sort of non-ideal process in which, there's very little participation starting things off, but as things progress, there's going to be more and more participation leading up to the eventual culmination of the ideal world. And also, what I brought up before with the Mars 2 example is that all these Martians are die, but like that's not the end to them. What if you have an all-powerful, all-loving, and all-knowing God? Because God could just resurrect those Martians. Similarly, for all of the extinction points of the animal history, evolutionary history of life on Earth, God can, and I expect, to resurrect these creatures or provide them with a sort of compensation for the sufferings that they've endured, such that they live out their lives, the rest of their lives, in an ideal world, even though they were the products of a non-ideal world's circumstances. Like, they came to exist and then quickly died off, and they didn't really play much of a contributional role in the world. But that's because they were a product or a consequence of the non-ideal facts of the world, rather than a major player. They weren't one of the few actual contributors towards the causal process. But as it is, their existence is still going to be a feature of the eventual idealization of the world, because they will exist in that ideal world. And so whatever causal role that they played in sustaining their own existence would still play a part with regards to the sort of character or features that they had, and will continue to have in that idealized state at the end of the world.
Okay, so take every creature that's in existence today and then trace its lineage back to abiogenesis, like the beginning of life.
Mm-hmm.
There's going to be tons of forms that have obviously gone extinct that that we've come from, and they've going to have kind of had many offspring. Those forms will have obviously then gone on to create new forms of themselves and new versions and new branches on the tree and stuff. So I don't really have an issue with the lineage that goes back to all creatures right now, say, or even within the last 100,000 years. It doesn't really matter. Like, pick a time frame, all the lines that go back from that space. There's going to be tons of death and tons of suffering and stuff, but we're all moving towards this ideal world. Like what you've just said, like it makes sense against that image. What I struggle to reconcile is if you go back to whenever, like, say Homo neanderthalis, for instance, some of them will have propagated into us, others won't have. So let's say all Homo neanderthals are in that, but then say that they then propagated into something else, and over the next 100 billion years they then became something else. You could span it in whichever way you want. Basically, there's going to be many branches that come off that aren't even within our genius, all the way through to abiogenesis, that have just come into existence for literally no purpose because they haven't brought into fruition any actualization. And I guess the question really is, it just fundamentally doesn't really make sense why that would be the strategy. What feels like mindless, blind chance strategy to push things into where we are today. It feels like there would be a justifiable reason for bringing these things into existence to move into the kind of purely idealized state that we're trying to get to, rather than just a misc. You're going to live because you're kind of attributed to these things which are going to be going into that state. Sure, you're going to be recompensed with your being resurrected in whatever state X, Y, Z, but them being brought into existence in the first place, they don't need to be there. So it's kind of a question like, why are they there? Why aren't their souls, if that's what we're saying is part of them, not brought into something that's going to be brought into the idealized state? It just doesn't, as far as I can, like this for me is the big crux of the issue. It doesn't make sense to branch off and end. It makes sense to, sure, have branches that kind of flux, but not so deviate from where we get to.
Yeah. So if we were to expect God to like supervise the entire causal process leading up to the ideal state of the world, we would expect for the only things that exist be things that were actively contributing towards the eventual idealization of the world. That's something that we would kind of expect for God to do, I guess. But if we think that the supervision of the causal process leading up to the idealization of the world would be a good thing for God to do, we could similarly ask, well, whether it would be a good thing for creatures to also contribute towards that good deed of supervising the way that things go out. And I think that, yeah, like God would be generous enough to even share in that sort of process as well, even knowing beforehand that it's going to lead to a lot of errors and a lot of false starts and a lot of stopping points for that entire process. But it still gives the creatures themselves a lot more agency with the way that things turn out than if God were to be supervising the entire process and stepping in that entire whole time. So like there's the there's talk of no, it's not Isaac Newton. Jeez, the inventor of the light bulb. Oh man, it's Thomas Edison. Yeah. Okay, so Thomas Edison, he underwent a significant amount of attempts. I don't know how true this story is, but we'll say that it's true for this, before finally arriving at a successful light bulb. And so people are asking, like, well, don't you feel like frustrated by the fact that you had to learn you had to try all these things and failed the entire time? It's like, no, I didn't fail. I learned 100 different ways in which a light bulb doesn't work. So all I needed was one. And so there's a sense in which, yeah, if we were to look at the current light bulbs that we have today, although now we have LEDs mostly instead of incandescent light bulbs. But okay, if we were to look at the incandescent light bulbs and we would sort of look back at the sort of causal history that led to that, it's going to have a lot of dead ends because you have all these light bulbs that Edison tried to work with like different types of hair and wires and how much electricity, the ampage and different things like that. And all those failed. And it wasn't until he finally arrived at a good one that it worked. And I think like if we were to think about all of the creatures that exist as like failed light bulbs, there would be something to appreciate about the fact that they were part of the process, even if they weren't the eventual the main contributing factor towards the eventual idealization of the world. Like, maybe a Tyrannosaurus Rex recognizes that. Well, yeah, this is more to like impose like rational beliefs upon the Tyrannosaurus Rex, but we can talk about a sort of conditional consent or a conditional belief that. Not a conditional, a hypothetical belief that a Tyrannosaurus would have if it were to be rational, to sort of appreciate the fact that, like, look, a world in which there are a lot of Tyrannosaurus Rexes makes it very difficult for ape-like hominids to sort of, or not ape-like, hominids to sort of develop rational faculties. And so it's kind of a good thing that me and my species went out of existence so that the good of rational creatures could eventually be brought about. And so maybe there's this sort of hypothetical consent on the part of the Tyrannosaurus Rex that when annihilated. And then also the appreciation of the fact that, in that during this lifetime, everything has a finite end to it, but in the next lifetime, there is the ideal state of the world in which everything can live for eternity. And so it's not going to be that upsetting to know that, oh, these creatures were born into a state of the world in which they have to suffer, but at least they're suffering. Wait, I think I started that sentence wanting to go one way and then changed the direction. So it's actually a good thing that a certain species became extinct, given the fact that that species will be able to have all of its members arrive at the ideal state of the world. Were it the case that a species never went extinct, then all of the members of that species that go on to an ideal state of the world would be stuck, or would be missing out on some of the other members of that species stuck in the non-ideal state of the world, because they're like living out in perpetuity. So like, let's say zebras. So like you have all of the zebras that have been killed by lions, and they're living out in some sort of heavenly paradise in an ideal state of the world. But then zebras have such a successful track record with regards to evolution that they're persisting in the non-ideal state of the world. And so you have a half, or not, maybe like 99.9% of the zebras in the ideal world, and then 1% of the zebras still in the non-ideal world. It seems like if we want these zebras to be reunited with one another, we should hope that in the non-ideal world, they will eventually go extinct, or that the zebras in the non-ideal world will be able to persist in that non-ideal world to the point that it finally attains idealization, in which they can be reunited with their fallen brethren. So yeah, those are a few considerations in response to this. I don't know how many of them are going to be plausible or like you'll be sympathetic towards, but at least those are some ideas that I've been thinking about regarding this problem.
That's super helpful. I mean, the one final thing I'll say on this before we move on to the final counterexample is simply that if you need to have rational creatures like humans to come into existence, and you have an all-powerful, all-loving, all-knowing God, it feels weird that God would utilize to bring about the flourishing or the ability of humans to come into existence, the slow cooking of dinosaurs over a week to 2 weeks, which is what happened basically. They slowly cooked. They didn't die quickly. They didn't die smoothly. They meteor hit, ash cloud covered the whole earth, and they slowly roasted like under a grill, watching the babies die and then them die. And, I can imagine that being a horrible situation of confusion. And I just find that to be like really interesting, where God could have definitely utilized other methods to bring about ends, if it has to be an end that needs to come because they needed to bring about the inclusion of humans for this. Or maybe I'm mistaken in saying that humans needs to be on the scene, and actually God's happy to use any creature as long as it evolves to the right state to recognize him potentially. Maybe that's how you'd counter that, but it just feels like a weird place to sit. Are there any final thoughts before we move on to that counter argument?
Yeah, just regards to the extinction event of the dinosaurs. Yeah, I would find it hard to say that God is the one that sort of like threw the asteroid basically to kill off all the dinosaurs. I think that rather is the case that these dinosaurs lived in a vulnerable state in a non-ideal world, such that it's possible that an asteroid can hit the planet Earth and annihilate them and cause them to face extinction. Um, and that's a feature of a non-ideal world that they had to live in basically in order to contribute towards that, or be a part of the process of contributing towards that eventual ideal state of the world. Were it the case that they had existed in an ideal state of the world, there wouldn't be the possibility for asteroids to exterminate their species. And were it the case that God was to prevent the asteroid from exterminating their species, then God would be sort of stepping in and like preventing any evil from occurring, making it so that he's not actually allowing the creatures to contribute towards the idealization of the world, because he's already starting it off ideal. In order for creatures to contribute towards the ideal state of the world, they have to first start off in a non-ideal state of the world, which means God has to take a sort of hands-off approach to the way that the world runs, so that the facts of the ideal world that they eventually arrive at would be genuinely the product of the creaturely contribution that they were providing. But yeah, if you want to go on to another step or say something further, that's fine. I'll let you decide.
I feel like we're at the stage in the Mario game where there's that block that you punch and there's like loads of coins coming out. Like this is the gold bit, I feel like, and I want to stay here forever, but we need to push on. Maybe
Sure.
we'll have to do like a part two, or we just focus on this one bit, because this for me this is the crux. Like everything you said so far, I can kind of understand and get behind, but it's this that I really struggle with, and not what's on the screen, the bit we're on before.
Oh, okay.
Natural evil, basically.
Yeah.
Okay, so I've called it a possible counter argument. Again, I'm new to creating arguments, so this is rubbish. I apologize. I'll read it out for those listening again. So, premise one: God, as traditionally understood, is an all-knowing, all-powerful being who is purely good in character. This understanding is rooted in various theological and philosophical traditions. Premise 2. Evil is fundamentally incompatible with God's character. The concept of a purely good being not only implies the absence of any malevolent intentions or actions, but also entails that God would not permit the existence of evils. Premise 3. It's conceivable that God could create a non-ideal world with creatures that contain fewer goods than a perfectly ideal world. This acknowledges the possibility of varying degrees of goodness within different worlds. Premise 4. The existence of non-ideal worlds does not necessitate the presence of evil. It is possible for a world to lack certain goods without including evil. Supportive example: a universe containing only hydrogen. Conclusion: therefore, if there was an initially non-ideal world with creatures, and if God remains purely good in character, it does not logically follow that evils could exist. This conclusion follows the premises that establish the compatibility of a non-ideal world with God's goodness while rejecting the inevitability of evil within such a context. I will let you dive into this, John, because you'll probably want to pick apart a few bits and pieces.
Yeah, I guess I'd want to know if your understanding of non-ideal in this argument is going to be the same definition that we've kind of been talking about before. Because what we were saying, an ideal state of the world is one in which it has only things worth having within it and no things worth avoiding. And so I'd imagine that a non-ideal state would have to either have nothing worth having or something worth avoiding within it. So would the idea be that a non-ideal world would be initially neutral? It has neither anything worth having nor anything worth avoiding. And so it's technically non-ideal because it doesn't have any good things in it yet. And it's only by and the fact that it could arrive at an ideal form of itself is through the eventual production of good things. And you never have to include any of the bad things that we would talk, what I'm mainly presuming with regards to a non-ideal world. Like over the course of this conversation, there's been the presumption that in a non-ideal world will have these things that are worth avoiding, which is just what we call evil. Um, is that kind of like what you're getting at, the idea that you could have things start off in a neutral way and then just contribute towards the goods in that way, and so it is going from non-ideal to ideal?
Yeah, it's basically neutrality. So it's not ideal, but it doesn't necessarily need to be non-ideal, if that makes sense. It's that
Okay.
neutral. It's like yeah, it's basically that sort of apex within the middle. Apex isn't the right word. It's that cross piece in the middle, and then it's going to move towards the good.
Yeah, I guess if God exists and God is everlasting, it's hard to say that there would be any worlds that are non-ideal without any sorts of evils with him, because like if God exists, he would already exist in a sort of ideal state, right? Because there's only good things. Like, yeah, when God exists alone, there's only things worth having, and there's nothing worth avoiding, because God is fully sufficient within himself. And so I don't know if God, it would be logically possible for God to create a non-ideal world that doesn't have evil in it, because that would require his non-existence in that world. Um, yeah, and God can't make himself not exist. So it seems like in order for God to create a non-ideal world which creatures can exist within in order to contribute towards the idealization of a world, they would have to exist in a world in which evils can occur.
Yeah, it's interesting. I kind of guess the way that I'm viewing this is that um, a so ideal being defined as ensuing only things worth having and nothing worth avoiding. The thing that could be worth avoiding is a neutral state, and the thing that's worth
Mm,
ensuing is God. So it's almost like you're kind of you're just so say you've got kind of 1, 2, and 3, 1 being negative, 2
mm-hmm,
being neutral, and 3 being positive. You're basically pulling off the tail of 1, and you're just holding 2. You're saying 2 is prior state, it's neutral, and it's worth
mm-hmm.
avoiding because of its neutrality. You don't want to stay in this neutral state. You want to progress towards that which is idealized, and actually that idealization comes into God. Why would you logically need to have a negative to then move towards the positive? Why couldn't you logically start with a neutrality and then move towards it?
Yeah, I guess I'd want to say that the only things that are worth avoiding are things which are intrinsically bad. And so I don't think you would ever have any reason to avoid a neutral state. You may have a reason to seek out a positive state, but that's different from saying avoiding a neutral state. Like, yeah, if there's nothing around you that is a danger to you, are you now like avoiding that room? There's currently nothing in your room that is a threat to your life, and so it's neutral. And so, do you have reason to like run away from that room so that all these neutral things aren't, you're not going to be near them? That seems, yeah, kind of
Well,
weird
I
to me.
guess I could say the room is bland and basic and boring, and I know that I can do it up. I can put a bookshelf in, I can get myself a sofa, or I can begin to make this room a better than neutral state. It doesn't have to entail a negativity to make me want to practically move into a positivity. That doesn't
Okay.
seem to make sense.
So would the idea be then that God creates creatures in an initially boring state so that they would be motivated to avoid that boring state and then contribute towards a state of affairs which is like intrinsically entertaining and something that is always captivating?
Well, if we're saying that there are rational beings able to logically pursue goals and decisions and dreams and actualize those in environments, then I can't see why it wouldn't be possible for us to start off in that, like not start off through evolution, but start off with, like, we can use humans as an example. There
Mm-hmm.
are humans who have those capacities that I just mentioned. They're brought into existence ex nihilo,
Yeah.
and they can then move from that state into an actualized state. They are then participants in moving towards that purely ideal state that we mentioned before. That feels like it's totally logically possible.
Yeah, no, I agree. Like similar to the idea of God being able to create an ideal state of affairs wholly of himself, ex nihilo. That's possible. And then the question is, well, which would be better for God to do this sort of ex nihilo act, or for God to create the world in that state through the contribution of creatures besides himself? And so we can similarly ask this of the view, well, what if God were to create a world in which there were these rational agents, and these rational agents had interest in trying to improve the world to the point of perfection? God could have created that world. And so the question can be asked like, well, yes, God could create the world and it would be good for him to do so. But were it the case that creatures were able to also co-contribute toward, or be co-causes of that state of affairs, would that be a good thing for those creatures to be able to do? And if I think that, yeah, using similar reasoning as to why it would be good for God to do this thing, it should similarly be good for creatures to contribute towards the bringing about of that state of affairs. That would give God some reason, some greater reason to precede that state of affairs with it not being the case. So creating a world in which there are not rational agents that are in a purely boring state. They're rather either rational agents in a non-boring but non-ideal state, that being a state in which there's evils, or a state in which there are just no rational agents, and so they have to have some sort of evolutionary process preceding their existence.
Yeah, it's really complicated. I think that the place that I think this argument falls down is around the consciousness element. So the supporting example I give is a universe containing only hydrogen. And if you were going to go for a sort of a panpsychist view, you could begin to say that that's still conscious and therefore it's a good thing. But it feels really difficult to have good without consciousness. Again, we can look back to that sort of the idea we had of God actualizing various worlds for various creatures, that they could begin to, wolves could go and hunt and eat creatures, but those creatures weren't conscious, so it's totally fine for that to happen because it wasn't morally abhorrent or anything. And I think the sort of jump that I see in my counter example is really around that sort of the existence of a non-ideal world not necessarily having evil. It's possible for it to lack certain goods, but actually, do you lack all good if you don't have the ability to have a conscious entity? Like, would the world have been good for the first X billion years before? If say Earth is the only planet with life on us, and that's true, we have no idea. But say that is true, we take that as a fact, brute fact. Would it have been good for that thing to be in existence until there was the ability for conscious creatures to be on the scene? I don't know. That's where I would want to start picking apart the argument. I'm aware I've jumped a little bit from what you were saying. I'm only doing it because I'm aware of time and I need to head off in the next sort of 5-10 minutes.
Yeah,
that's
same.
where I think that this potentially falls down. I don't know. Do you see gaps in that place, or do you think there's a way to kind of pave that over?
No, it's an interesting argument, and I guess I'd want to I tend to agree that in order for a thing to be good, it must be conscious, because otherwise, it's funny. You can run a sort of I don't know. I being a theist, I think that I would sort of expect for God to make panpsychism true, because God wants to maximize the amount of good things in the world, and so if things are conscious, then they're going to have some element of goodness to them, and so gives me reason to expect that panpsychism would be true under theism. Now, I happen to think panpsychism fits a little bit better with this theodicy, but I don't take it as a prerequisite to the theodicy. I think it can be made sense of on a dualistic or a monistic non-panpsychist view out there. So yeah, the question is, the existence of non-ideal worlds does not necessitate the presence of evil. It is possible for a world to lack certain goods without including evil. Yes, I would say that's generally the case, but not when it's the case that God already exists and cannot cause himself to cease to exist. So if God exists, there's going to be some good thing in the world, right? Because God is good. And so in order for the world to be non-ideal, some bad element is going to have to be added to it. Because, a world with only hydrogen atoms is a consistent state of affairs. It's not logically impossible. And it would be a non-ideal world because there's nothing good within that world. But that's going to be inconsistent with God's existence, because God can't make it to be the case that the only things that exist are hydrogen atoms, or the only concrete objects that exist are hydrogen atoms, because abstractive might be necessary. Because that would require God to cause himself to cease to exist. And so I think that the only sorts of non-ideal worlds that are consistent with God are going to be the worlds in which evils can occur. And I think that is going to be a strict logical necessity. So I think, premise 4 is true, but it's irrelevant to the point of God's decision making, because God has to take into consideration what sorts of worlds are possible and consistent with his own existence, because he can't make himself cease to exist.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think we've covered an absolute ton of ground today. And I already mentioned there'll be kind of links in the description for people to check out your paper, which has the argument in itself. If people want these counterexamples or this counter argument, I can make those available as well. I'm not sure they're particularly needed, but there'll definitely be the link to your paper and your actual argument itself, John, the sort of Participation Theodicy.
Thank you.
Is there anything you want to say to close? I'm aware that we've hit so many notes. Might be something in your brain you're like, I just want to say that one thing that I forgot to say at the start. Like, is there anything that we've missed?
Yeah, well, it's not really a miss. I just wanted to express my gratitude towards you and being able to talk this through with me, because I came up with this theodicy as a response to my own wrestling with the problem of evil, and I'm not fully convinced of it. I find it quite plausible. I find that the reasoning and the methodology to the theodicy very promising, and so that's why I'm like publicly defending it, because I want to see how far it can go. If it be the case that somebody comes up with a perfect counterexample, and you very well may have with this possible counter argument here, I'd want to know about it, and so that I can correct. I can either modify the theodicy so as to incorporate these counterexamples, or to find out what the problem with these sort of counterexamples are, so that I can respond to them better in the future. Or I can reject my theodicy because I found that this counterexample is fully plausible and it is a true counterexample, and there's no way in which to fix my theodicy in the face of it. And so, yeah, I really appreciate all the talks that I've had with many atheists online, and especially you, and how you're sort of being able to talk this through with me in a charitable way and in a genuine way, that you are really trying to understand the theodicy. And I really appreciate that. And I really appreciate, being able to discuss this with you. So thank you, Samuel.
Yeah, John, mate, it's been beautiful. I think the thing I find the most fascinating about theodicies is the worldviews upon which they pull, because every argument, right, is going to you're going to have a foundation or a structure above it that's making it make sense, that you're drawing from to kind of pull something together. Like you're pulling your shoelaces tight, but you pull it all together. And the only way you get into those bedrocks is by having these conversations. So the fact that we've gone for 3.5 hours, that we've covered so much ground, has been it's been an absolute delight, mate. Thank you so much. There'll be links to you obviously in the description, but other than Twitter, is there anywhere else you'd like people to go?
I've been on Emerson Green's channel several times. That's like some of the best conversations that I've had with people online. Like, I have a YouTube channel, but like the stuff on there is very, like, I don't know, it's not that worthwhile. I think a lot of the worthwhile stuff is doing conversations like this with people like you, as well as Dry Apologist. I really appreciate his channel, and it is through my encounters with Dry Apologist that I came to sort of develop and think about the problem of evil in a more serious fashion. But if you're interested in the discussion about the problem of evil, I would recommend listening to my discussion with Emerson Green on his channel. Yeah, the YouTube channel Emerson Green, or it's also on his podcast Counter Apologetics. And we discussed a lot of the common topics here as well. And I think that a lot of very similar concerns that he had, that you have as well. And I think that is very worthwhile and taking into consideration, hopefully resolving in order for this argument to go through. But just the Twitter is perfectly fine. So yeah, thank you.
Sweet. Yeah, well, there'll be links to Emerson Green's channel as well. I'm a big fan of Mr. Green, and I really enjoyed you and him speaking about universalism. Thought that was a really, really good, honest philosophical dialogue. So there'll be links to that as well. But yeah, John, mate, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you, Samuel.
Thanks for checking out this episode. Please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. And make sure you check us out over on Locals. Cheers.